The year was 1912, and the North Atlantic was locked in ice. The winter had been long, the storms relentless, and yet the men of Newfoundland prepared themselves for another sealing voyage. They were accustomed to hardship. Life on the harsh coast demanded endurance, and the seal hunt was both a means of survival and a gamble with death. It was in this frozen world that one of the darkest and least remembered tragedies in maritime history unfolded, a disaster so haunting that survivors would never speak of it without trembling, and so grim that whole communities would be scarred for generations. This was the story of the sealers who froze where they stood, abandoned on drifting ice, lost not to fire or sinking ships, but to the silent and merciless cold. The disaster came to be known simply as the Newfoundland sealing tragedy. It was a name that carried whispers of horror across villages where every family had lost someone, where mothers mourned their sons and wives buried their husbands without bodies to lay in the earth. On the surface, it was a tale of bad weather, of men caught on shifting ice floes in an unexpected blizzard. But beneath the ice and snow was something more sinister: decisions made in boardrooms, orders given by shipowners, and the grim arithmetic of profit valued above human life. These men did not freeze to death by accident. They froze because they were sent onto the ice underprepared, underprotected, and ultimately abandoned. Imagine the scene. Over 100 men spread across miles of ice, swinging clubs, killing seals, hauling skins and pelts as a storm brewed on the horizon. The temperature plummeted, the snow began to blind, and the ice drifted farther and farther from the safety of their ship. As darkness fell, they realized no help was coming. There was no shelter, no fire, no food. The sea ice beneath their boots cracked and shifted with every gust of wind, carrying them farther into the void. Some tried to huddle together for warmth, their bodies pressed against one another as the blizzard howled, but the cold was merciless. One by one, men collapsed, their limbs stiffening, their voices fading into silence. When rescuers finally came, they found bodies frozen mid-step, faces twisted in agony, men locked in postures of prayer or reaching for the horizon that had betrayed them. This was not an isolated misfortune. Newfoundland's sealing industry had always demanded sacrifice. Men were lost every year, swallowed by the sea, crushed between ice pans, drowned when storms rolled in without warning. Yet the 1912 disaster was different. It was not just the scale of death. More than 70 men frozen in the open, another 20 or so gone in separate tragedies. It was the sheer negligence that allowed it to happen. Even as families waited on shore, praying for news, those responsible hesitated, delayed, and minimized what was unfolding. By the time the truth came out, entire villages were left shattered, and a dark stain had spread over the sealing trade itself. But history is cruel in its selectivity. Just 2 weeks after the bodies of the Newfoundland sealers were recovered from the ice, the world would be transfixed by another tragedy, the sinking of the Titanic. Newspapers filled their pages with stories of the wealthy lost in the North Atlantic, the orchestra that played as the ship went down, the scale of the engineering hubris that failed. The frozen men of Newfoundland, poor fishermen, and sealers, became a footnote. Their coffins lined the St. John's Wharf for grieving families to claim, yet the international spotlight shifted elsewhere. What might have been remembered as one of the most haunting maritime disasters in history was instead overshadowed, buried beneath the myth of the Titanic. Yet for those who lived in Newfoundland, the memory never faded. The haunting images of men frozen upright, preserved by the very cold that killed them, were seared into the island's collective memory. Songs were written, stories passed down, and for generations afterward, the disaster remained a warning of how greed and negligence could turn the sea into a graveyard. These were not nameless, faceless victims. They were neighbors, fathers, sons, brothers. They lived in wooden houses by the shore. They worked the fisheries. They knew hunger and poverty. Their loss was not just a maritime statistic but a human wound that reshaped communities. To understand this tragedy, one must go beyond the ice itself and into the world that produced it. The sealing industry was built on desperation. Newfoundland was an isolated colony, its people struggling against harsh winters and limited resources. The seal hunt, brutal as it was, offered income that families relied upon to survive. Every spring, men risked their lives for pelts that would be sold in far-off markets. Shipowners pushed them harder each year, chasing profits in a dangerous game where the ice always held the upper hand. It was a system that rewarded recklessness, where the lives of working men were expendable, and where tragedies like 1912 were inevitable. The story you are about to hear is not just about men freezing on the ice. It is about the choices that led them there, the voices that went unheard, and the silence that followed when the world turned its attention elsewhere. It is about the way nature punishes arrogance, and how human greed amplifies disaster. Most of all, it is a story of memory, how some tragedies echo through generations, while others are forgotten in the shadow of more glamorous catastrophes. As we journey back to 1912, to the windswept coasts of Newfoundland and the blood-stained ice of the seal hunt, we will unravel the chain of events that led to one of the darkest chapters in maritime history. We will walk alongside the men as they set out, full of hope for a successful season. We will stand with them on the ice as the storm closes in, feel the creeping numbness as frost claims their bodies, and witness the silence when help fails to arrive. By the end, the frozen figures of the Newfoundland sealers will no longer be a forgotten footnote in history, but a haunting reminder of the human cost hidden beneath the ice. Newfoundland in the early 20th century was not a place of ease or abundance. It was a rugged island at the edge of the North Atlantic, battered by storms, bound by ice in winter, and reliant on the fickle mercy of the sea for survival. Life for the average Newfoundlander was unforgiving. Families lived in small wooden houses, often without insulation, relying on firewood and fish to sustain them through the long winters. Poverty was widespread, and for most men, the options for earning a living were brutally limited. They fished cod in the warmer months, they cut timber, and when the spring came, they hunted seals on the vast, frozen ocean. The seal hunt was not merely an occupation, it was a necessity, a tradition, and for many, a test of masculinity and endurance. The sealing industry had been a cornerstone of Newfoundland's economy for more than a century. Seals provided oil for lamps, pelts for clothing and leather, and meat for consumption or trade. Every spring, when the ice floes drifted south from the Arctic, ships set out from St. John's, Harbour Grace, and other coastal towns. These voyages were eagerly anticipated. They offered work to thousands of men, many of whom depended on the meagre wages to pay off debts and keep their families alive through the year. But the promise of income came with enormous risk. It was said that no man could count himself truly Newfoundlander until he had faced the ice, and many never returned from it. The work itself was brutal. Sealers were expected to leave their ships and fan out across the ice pans, carrying little more than a gaff, a long wooden pole with an iron hook, and sometimes clubs or rifles. They walked for miles on treacherous surfaces that could crack or tilt without warning, with freezing seawater rushing in beneath their feet. Once they located herds of harp seals, they set upon them with methodical violence. The men killed quickly and efficiently, stripping the pelts, harvesting the fat, and leaving behind blood-stained snow. To outsiders, the hunt seemed cruel, almost barbaric, but to the men who did it, it was survival. The cries of the seals and the red-streaked ice were part of the yearly ritual that kept their communities alive. The sealing ships themselves were often poorly equipped for safety. Wooden steamers, sometimes decades old, carried crews of hundreds into some of the most dangerous waters on Earth. The conditions on board were cramped and unsanitary. Food was scarce, consisting of salted meat, bread, and tea. Many men slept in damp bunks, their clothes never fully dry. Frostbite and illness were common companions, and discipline was harsh. Shipowners and captains drove their crews relentlessly, knowing that every hour spent on the ice meant more pelts and more profit. The men were paid by the number of pelts they processed, not by the hour, which meant their labor was tied directly to how far they were willing to push their bodies into exhaustion. It is important to understand that the sealing industry was not driven by romance or adventure, as some tried to portray it in songs and stories. It was driven by desperation. The men who went to the ice were often indebted to merchants who controlled the fishing economy back home. This truck system kept many families in perpetual poverty, as merchants loaned goods and supplies on credit during the winter, to be repaid with fish or sealing wages later. Failure to join the sealing voyages often meant starvation for a man's family. Thus, the hunt was not so much a choice as it was an obligation pressed upon the poor by circumstance. By 1912, sealing was both a seasonal expectation and a competitive industry. Shipowners outfitted multiple vessels, each eager to bring in the largest catch of seals. Captains were often rewarded for the number of pelts brought home, which encouraged recklessness. Ships would race to reach the ice fields, and men were sometimes ordered onto the ice in unsafe conditions in order to gain an advantage over rival crews. Safety precautions were minimal, and lives of working men were seen as expendable compared to the profit margins of the sealing companies. This culture of haste and negligence created the perfect environment for disaster. The natural world added to the danger. The North Atlantic in early spring was a place of constant transformation. Ice fields could stretch as far as the eye could see one moment, and then break apart under the pressure of wind and tide the next. Temperatures could plunge suddenly, storms could roll in without warning, and whiteout conditions could disorient even the most experienced sealers. A man could become lost within minutes, swallowed by fog and snow, with no landmarks to guide him back to the ship. Even if he were only a few hundred yards away, he might as well have been miles off, his cries for help drowned out by the wind. The sea was indifferent, and the ice was merciless. Still, sealing retained a certain grim pride within Newfoundland's culture. Songs and stories celebrated the courage of men who ventured onto the ice. To endure the hunt was to prove one's worth, to demonstrate toughness and resilience in the face of nature's cruelty. Entire communities revolved around this annual event, watching for the ships to return with their holds full of pelts. When they did, the profits trickled into local shops and households, bringing a brief season of relief. When they didn't, or when tragedy struck, the grief spread like wildfire, leaving behind widowhood, orphan children, and communities hollowed by loss. This was the world from which the Newfoundland disaster emerged. It was not merely an accident of weather or chance, but a product of an economic system that placed men in harm's way year after year. The sealing industry was a machine that fed on human endurance and ignored human fragility. Each voyage into the ice was a gamble with death, and every man who set out knew that he might not return. The sealing disaster of 1912 did not arise from nowhere. It was the inevitable consequence of decades of exploitation, reckless competition, and the belief that human lives were worth less than the pelts they carried back to shore. When we hear of the men stranded on the ice, freezing under the endless night, we must remember the context that brought them there. They were not adventurers chasing glory, nor reckless fools ignoring danger. They were fathers and sons pressed into service by poverty, driven by necessity, and placed in peril by systems of greed that valued profit above all else. To understand their fate, one must first understand Newfoundland itself, a place of unforgiving beauty, crushing hardship, and traditions carved from ice, blood, and survival. They were not nameless figures lost to history, though many of their bodies would later be found frozen stiff on the ice, indistinguishable from one another. The men of the sealing steamer Newfoundland in 1912 were real, breathing individuals with families, stories, and ambitions. They came from the fishing villages that dotted the harsh coastline of Newfoundland, places like Bonavista, St. John's, and Wesleyville. These communities were small, tightly knit, and often defined by the struggle against the elements. In such places, everyone knew the sea, and nearly every man's livelihood depended on it. The seal hunt was a natural extension of that life. To know who these men were is to understand not only their fate but also the crushing weight of necessity that drove them onto the ice in the first place. Most of the sealers were poor fishermen, living in a society where poverty was the rule, not the exception. They were accustomed to mending nets, hauling cod from cold waters, and enduring long stretches of hunger when catches failed. These were not men who sought adventure or glory but men who sought bread for their children. Some were barely teenagers, joining their fathers on sealing voyages as a rite of passage, their first steps into the brutal world of adult labor. Others were grizzled veterans of the hunt, their faces carved by wind and salt, their hands rough and scarred from years of toil. Together, they formed a crew that reflected the entire social fabric of Newfoundland's working class, young and old, inexperienced and seasoned, bound together by necessity. The sealing season was more than just an economic venture. It was an event that shaped the rhythm of life. Each spring, when the ice began to move southward, whole families prepared for the departure of their men. Wives and mothers packed what clothing and provisions could be spared, though they knew the ships offered little comfort. Children watched their fathers leave, often with both pride and dread, aware that some of them would never return. In the small communities of Newfoundland, sealing disasters were already part of collective memory. Names of men lost on previous voyages were whispered like prayers, reminders of the thin line between survival and death. The men of the Newfoundland carried those stories with them as they boarded the ship in 1912, though none could have imagined the scale of the tragedy about to unfold. At the heart of the sealing system was an unbalanced relationship between shipowners and labourists. The men were paid poorly, often only a fraction of the profits their work generated, and were forced to endure the harshest risks. Shipowners, on the other hand, operated from positions of safety and privilege, rarely setting foot on the ice themselves. They saw the sealers as expendable tools in a larger machine of commerce. For many of the men, their participation in the hunt was not voluntary in the true sense of the word. They owed debts to local merchants, debts that could only be repaid with their wages from fishing and sealing. To refuse the hunt was to invite financial ruin for one's family. Despite this grim reality, there was camaraderie among the men. Crews bonded over long hours at sea, shared hardship, and the collective danger of the hunt. They told stories, sang songs, and relied on each other for survival when conditions turned deadly. In Newfoundland culture, sealing was seen as a measure of manhood. A boy who braved the ice and returned was no longer a child but a man, hardened by the experience. For veterans, the hunt was proof of resilience, a demonstration that they could endure where others might falter. This sense of pride existed alongside the ever-present awareness of risk, creating a paradox in which men both dreaded and valued the hunt. Among the crew were fathers who had left behind large families, their absence leaving wives to manage households and younger children. For these men, the success of the sealing voyage could mean the difference between survival and starvation during the following winter. Others were bachelors, seeking to save enough money to marry or to establish themselves. There were men in their 60s, seasoned and tough, still going to the ice because they had no other choice. And there were boys as young as 14, walking in the footsteps of fathers and uncles, often pushed by poverty to join before they were truly ready. Their voices, laughter, and songs filled the decks of the Newfoundland before the storm, adding to the sense of humanity now missing from the grim statistics that later recorded their deaths. The personalities of the men varied, but most shared traits born from their environment. They were resilient, accustomed to hardship, and often possessed a dark humor that allowed them to laugh in the face of misery. Stories tell of men joking even as storms battered their ship, or singing as they swung their clubs against the seals. Their toughness was not bravado but necessity. In a land where winter seemed endless, where hunger was a constant companion, and where death at sea was common, one had to adopt a hardened spirit to endure. The sealing crews became microcosms of that spirit, stubborn, determined, and bound by an unspoken code of solidarity. What made the 1912 crew particularly vulnerable, however, was the leadership above them. The ship's owners and captains were not men who shared the ice with their laboris. They were decision-makers motivated by competition and profit. The men on the ice trusted that their leaders would not abandon them, that they would be guided by experience and care. That trust would prove tragically misplaced. Many of the men went willingly, believing they were part of a tradition that, while dangerous, was also honorable. But in reality, they were pawns in a larger economic game where their lives were expendable. When one considers the crew of the Newfoundland, it is important not to see them only as victims of a single catastrophe. They were human beings shaped by their environment, by poverty, by community, and by tradition. Their lives before the ice were filled with laughter, arguments, hopes, and fears. They married, they raised children, they fished, and they endured. What makes their fate so tragic is that they carried all of this humanity onto the ice, only to be stripped of it by the decisions of those who saw them as numbers on a balance sheet. By knowing who they were, by giving faces to the nameless, we can begin to understand the true scale of the loss. The disaster of 1912 was not just the freezing of men on ice floes. It was the silencing of voices that once filled homes and villages, the breaking of families, the severing of bonds of community. Each man carried with him not only his own life but the lives of those who depended on him. When he froze on the ice, entire households collapsed in grief and poverty. The crew of the Newfoundland were more than victims. They were the embodiment of Newfoundland itself, tough, resilient, and deeply human, forced into an impossible gamble against the cruelest of seas. March of 1912 arrived with a deceptive calm. Winter had already left its heavy mark on Newfoundland, but the ice was beginning to shift, moving southward in great white sheets. For the sealing fleet, this was the signal. The herds of harp seals would soon be on the ice pans, and the race for pelts would begin. In St. John's, Harbour Grace, and the small communities scattered along the coast, the departure of sealing ships was a moment of ritual. Families crowded the wharves to see the men off, waving handkerchiefs and scarves against the cold wind. Mothers prayed quietly. Wives held children close. The men themselves, bundled in rough wool, sheepskin boots, and patched oilskins, climbed aboard their ships with an air of grim determination. This was not adventure. It was duty, necessity, and for some, a final farewell they did not realize they were making. The Newfoundland was not the largest or strongest vessel in the fleet, but she had made many trips to the ice before. She was a wooden steamer, aging and prone to faults, but to the men who boarded her that spring, she was simply the platform between them and the seals. Her decks were crowded with men and supplies, gaffs, rifles, knives, food barrels, and the meager personal belongings of the crew. The atmosphere was one of restlessness. Some men sang to pass the time, others sharpened their tools, while many simply stared out at the grey horizon, lost in thought. They knew the dangers of the hunt, but they also knew that hesitation would not change their fate. The sealing fleet that year was commanded with a competitive fervor. Rival ships, such as the Stefano and the Bellaventure, were also preparing to sail. Each captain wanted to claim the richest catch, and each shipowner demanded speed and results. This created an atmosphere of reckless urgency. Captains pushed their crews harder, and men were ordered onto the ice in ever more dangerous conditions. Safety was rarely discussed. Profit was the language of the hunt. The men of the Newfoundland were aware of this, but awareness did not equal choice. For many, staying home meant hunger. Going to the ice meant a chance at wages, however small. As the Newfoundland set out, small warning signs were already present. Unlike some of the better-equipped ships, she had no wireless radio on board. The absence of this communication system was critical. In 1912, wireless was still relatively new, but it had already proven its value in coordinating ships and warning of dangers. The Newfoundland's owners chose not to pay for such equipment, seeing it as an unnecessary expense. This single decision would later mean the difference between life and death for scores of men. For now, however, the crew accepted it without question. They had no voice in such matters. The departure itself was bittersweet. As the ship pulled away from the wharf, families shouted final goodbyes. Children ran along the shore, waving until the vessel disappeared from sight. Some men joked loudly to cover their unease, calling back promises to return with pockets full of money. Others stood silent, gripping the rail, faces set against the wind. In the minds of many wives and mothers, there was always the unspoken question: would they see these men again? Sealing was a tradition, but it was also a yearly gamble with fate. The voyage out was grueling in its own right. The sea was a restless grey, dotted with chunks of drifting ice that grew larger the farther north they travelled. The ship creaked under strain as it pushed through the floes, sometimes shuddering when larger pans struck her hull. Life on board was far from comfortable. The men ate salted beef, hard bread, and weak tea, often served cold. They slept in crowded bunks, the air damp with condensation and smoke from the galley. Rats scurried in the shadows. Yet these were conditions the men accepted without complaint. Complaining did not fill bellies, nor did it make the ice any less deadly. They were hardened to hardship. Their spirits carried more by determination than by comfort. There was also a mood of anticipation. The men were eager to reach the seals, to begin the bloody work that promised wages. They spoke of the season ahead, of where the herds might be found, of how many pelts they might take. But beneath the chatter lay tension. Stories of past disasters circulated in hushed tones: men lost in storms, men swallowed by cracks in the ice, men frozen before rescue could arrive. These memories were part of the culture of sealing, warnings carried forward with each new generation. They were reminders of the thin margin between success and catastrophe. The captain of the Newfoundland carried his own burdens. Pressure from the owners was immense. Every delay meant lost profit, every missed opportunity a potential disaster for the company's bottom line. Decisions were made not with caution in mind, but with competition at the forefront. Captains were rewarded for aggressive strategies, not for restraint. This created an environment where risk was normalized. Sending men onto ice in poor weather, leaving them out longer than was safe, cutting corners on supplies, these were accepted practices. The men trusted their captain to bring them home, but the captain's loyalty was often divided between his crew and his employers. The days leading up to the tragedy were marked by small but telling oversights. Provisions were thin, clothing inadequate for the deep cold, and discipline on board more concerned with productivity than with preparation. The absence of wireless meant that when storms developed or ice conditions shifted, communication between ships would be slow, confused, or non-existent. Each vessel was, in a sense, isolated, left to gamble on its own decisions. The men on deck could not know it, but they were sailing into a perfect storm of circumstance: outdated equipment, poor communication, relentless competition, and a disregard for the human cost of profit. Still, for those aboard the Newfoundland, the voyage outward felt like countless others before it. They were accustomed to hardship and blind to the decisions being made above them. They talked, they sang, they mended clothing, and they waited for the moment when the order would come to go onto the ice. What lay ahead was unimaginable, though in hindsight, the signs were all there. The journey of the Newfoundland in March 1912 was not just a routine voyage. It was the opening act of a tragedy written by greed, shaped by negligence, and sealed by the merciless hand of nature. The ice field stretched endlessly before them, a shifting white desert broken only by the dark shapes of seals sprawled across the pans. By late March 1912, the hunt was in full swing. For the men of the Newfoundland, this was the moment they had prepared for, the brutal work that would define the voyage. At first glance, the sight was almost serene. Thousands of harp seals clustered on the floes, their bodies resting against the stark whiteness, the sea groaning beneath them. But for the men who stepped off the ship, it was not beauty they saw. It was wages. Every animal meant a few coins in their pockets, a little more food on the table back home. The serenity of the ice was quickly broken by the chaos of the hunt. The order was given, and the men poured onto the floes, carrying gaffs, clubs, and rifles. The hunt began with shouts, the crunch of boots, and the cries of seals. The animals were struck, skinned, and stripped in a frenzy of activity. Blood seeped into the snow, painting it crimson in every direction. To outsiders, it was a gruesome scene, but to the men it was business as usual. There was no room for hesitation or pity. Each pelt had to be stripped quickly before the carcass froze, and each hour counted. The faster the men worked, the greater their earnings. The labor was exhausting. Men hauled pelts across jagged ice, slipping and stumbling under the weight. The cold wind bit at their faces, and their clothes, already damp, grew heavier with ice. Yet they pressed on, driven by hunger and debt. There was a rhythm to the hunt, one they had practiced year after year. Kill, skin, haul, return. Their movements were efficient, almost mechanical, though beneath the rhythm lurked danger. The ice was unstable, fractured by tides and winds. Men leapt across gaps, tested uncertain pans, and often worked miles away from their ship. At any moment, the ice could shift, cutting them off. The competition among ships heightened the pressure. Rival vessels had also reached the ice, and each captain was determined to claim the largest catch. Crews could sometimes see one another in the distance, lines of men moving like black ants across the floes. The unspoken rivalry pushed everyone to work faster, to take greater risks. Men ventured farther and farther from the Newfoundland, driven by orders to cover more ground. The profits of the owners depended on their labor, and hesitation was discouraged. If one ship faltered, another would seize the advantage. The tools of the hunt told their own story. The gaff, a long wooden pole tipped with an iron hook, was as much a symbol of the seal hunt as the ships themselves. It served to pull pelts, drag carcasses, and steady men on the treacherous ice. Rifles were used sparingly, mostly for adult seals whose thick skulls resisted the club. But ammunition was costly, and most captains preferred the crude efficiency of blunt force. The brutality of the hunt left men spattered with blood, their gloves stiff with frozen fat. The smell clung to their clothes, mingling with sweat and salt. 4 hours, they labored in this gruesome environment, the white ice stained red, the cries of animals mixing with the shouts of men. For the sealers themselves, the hunt carried no romance. It was misery dressed as labor. Their hands grew numb, their boots filled with icy water, and the wind lashed at their faces until their skin cracked. Many men developed frostbite even during successful hunts, their fingers blackening before they returned to the ship. But complaints were rare. Complaining did not earn wages, and wages were all that mattered. To pause, to rest, was to fall behind. The knowledge that every pelt meant a few more pennies for one's family was enough to keep them moving long after their bodies begged for relief. The environment, however, was not passive. The ice was alive, shifting and groaning beneath their feet. A crack could open without warning, swallowing men and pelts into the freezing sea. Others might find themselves stranded on pans that drifted away from the main field, lost in fog and snow. The horizon itself played tricks on the eyes, distances distorted by light and reflection. A man could see his ship clearly one moment, only for it to vanish behind drifting ice the next. Orientation was a constant struggle, and in poor weather, it was terrifyingly easy to become lost. As the days of hunting wore on, tension grew. The Newfoundland was operating without a wireless radio, leaving her disconnected from other ships. Orders and information had to be relayed by sight or by chance encounters with nearby vessels. This lack of communication left her vulnerable. When rival ships spotted larger herds or when weather warnings arose, the Newfoundland's crew remained unaware. The men on the ice could not know this, of course. They trusted that their captain and officers were monitoring conditions, guiding them with safety in mind. That trust would soon be betrayed. There were small moments of humanity amid the brutality. Men sang as they worked, their voices carried by the wind. Jokes were shouted across the ice, Crude humor shared to cut the monotony. Older sealers offered advice to younger ones, teaching them how to move swiftly, how to test the strength of a flow before stepping onto it, how to swing a gaff efficiently. These brief exchanges reminded them that they were not just workers but brothers in hardship, bound by a shared struggle. Yet even in these moments, the shadow of danger hung over them. Every man knew that the ice gave no warnings, and that the sea cared nothing for their songs. By the end of each day, the men returned to their ship exhausted, carrying loads of pelts that filled the holds. They were stiff with cold, their hands raw, their faces windburned. On board, they ate what little food they could, often too tired to speak. Some fell asleep still wearing their blood-stained clothes, knowing they would rise at dawn to do it all again. The hunt was relentless, and time was always against them. For every delay, for every storm, profit slipped away. And so they worked, even as conditions grew harsher, even as the signs of danger mounted. The early days of the 1912 hunt seemed to follow the familiar pattern of hardship and labor, but beneath the surface, a storm was building. The rivalry of the ships, the lack of proper communication, the relentless push for profit, all of it combined into a deadly equation. The men on the ice, their bodies already battered by cold and fatigue, could not see what was coming. To them, the hunt was proceeding as it always had, bloody, grueling, and merciless. What they did not know was that they were being driven toward the brink of disaster, that the same ice which bore the weight of their labor would soon become the stage for one of the greatest tragedies in Newfoundland's history. The morning of March 31st, 1912, dawned with a deceptive clarity. The air was sharp, the horizon a frozen wasteland of white and grey. The men of the Newfoundland prepared themselves as they always did, pulling on stiffened mittens, adjusting boots already crusted with ice, and tightening belts around clothing that offered only limited protection against the cold. They were ordered out onto the ice, more than 130 of them, spread out in search of seals. At first, it was routine, hard, bloody, exhausting labor, but familiar. The floes stretched wide, dotted with the dark shapes of seals, and the men fanned out to claim their share. They did not know they were stepping into a trap written by greed, negligence, and nature itself. The ice beneath them was treacherous that day. Though it appeared solid, it was shifting constantly, pushed by winds and currents. Gaps opened unexpectedly, forcing men to leap across or risk falling into the Black Sea. The sky darkened gradually, the wind rising with a sinister edge. Some men looked to the horizon and sensed danger, but the orders from the captain's representatives were clear. Keep moving, keep working, drive farther across the floes. Profit demanded their labor, and hesitation was punished with lost time. By mid-afternoon, the storm rolled in. It came with startling speed, a wall of wind and snow that swallowed the ice field in white darkness. Visibility collapsed to nothing. Men who had been within shouting distance of each other suddenly vanished from sight. The horizon disappeared, and the ship itself seemed to dissolve into the blizzard. The men realized, with creeping dread, that they were alone. No signals reached them, no sound of the ship's whistle cut through the gale. The Newfoundland had pulled away, either by accident or decision, leaving them stranded. At first, they tried to carry on, moving in small groups, hoping the storm would pass. They huddled around piles of pelts, using them as crude windbreaks. Some tried to march back toward where they believed the ship had been, but the ice shifted beneath their feet, dragging them farther from safety. Hours passed, and the realization grew heavier. They were trapped on the drifting ice, with no shelter, no fire, and no food. The cold crept into their bodies with merciless speed. Night fell, and with it came a new level of horror. The temperature plummeted, the blizzard unrelenting. The men gathered in groups, clinging to one another for warmth. They lay on the ice in clusters, their bodies pressed together, hoping to generate enough heat to survive until morning. But the ice was no ally. It sucked the warmth from their limbs, numbing fingers, freezing feet solid in their boots. Some men moaned prayers, others cursed, and others fell silent as exhaustion overtook them. Frostbite set in quickly, blackening hands and faces. The storm raged above, indifferent to their suffering. By dawn, the scene was grim. Dozens had already perished, their bodies stiff on the ice. Survivors rose from shallow, restless sleep to find their companions frozen beside them, their eyes wide open, their mouths locked in silent screams. The living stumbled onward, delirious with cold and hunger. They wandered across the endless white, searching for the ship that had abandoned them, but the Newfoundland was nowhere to be found. The storm had blown them miles from its position, and the ship's officers, lacking wireless communication, had no way of knowing their precise location. The men were on their own. The second day was worse. Their bodies weakened, their minds clouded by hypothermia. Many began to hallucinate. Some claimed to see lights in the distance, guiding them to safety. Others swore they heard the whistle of a ship, or the voices of their families calling them home. These were the cruel tricks of a dying mind. A few men, delirious, stripped off their clothing, convinced they were burning hot. Others lay down in the snow, too tired to rise again, muttering prayers that trailed into silence. One by one, they froze where they fell. Survivor accounts describe scenes of haunting despair. Men froze in mid-step, their bodies locked upright, leaning forward as if still walking. Others died clinging to one another, faces pressed against shoulders, their final moments spent in desperate search of warmth. Some curled into fetal positions, their arms wrapped around themselves as if trying to retreat into childhood memories. The storm showed no mercy. Hours blurred into eternity. Time ceased to matter. Only the cold remained, carving its way into flesh and bone. By the second night, the survivors knew they were living on borrowed time. Hunger gnawed at them, but it was thirst that tormented them most. Some tried to eat snow, but the effort only sapped what little warmth remained. The wind screamed across the ice, drowning out voices, erasing all hope of signaling for help. In the blackness of that night, men whispered to one another, promising that if they survived, they would never return to the ice. Others spoke no words at all, their lips too frozen to move. Silence grew heavier with each passing hour. Meanwhile, aboard the Newfoundland, confusion reigned. The absence of wireless communication meant the ship's officers had no clear picture of their men's plight. Some believed the crews had found shelter near another vessel. Others assumed they were making their way back. The result was inaction. No rescue attempt was launched during those crucial hours. The men on the ice, freezing and dying by the dozen, were left entirely alone. When the storm finally subsided, the survivors were unrecognizable shadows of themselves. Their faces were blistered and blackened, their hands stiff, their clothing frozen solid. They staggered across the ice in search of salvation, but many could no longer walk. They collapsed, some still alive, too weak to rise. Those who managed to stay on their feet were haunted by the sight of bodies littering the ice. Friends, brothers, fathers, all scattered across the frozen expanse, locked in death poses that seemed almost sculpted. The ice had claimed them, preserved them in grotesque silence. In total, 78 men from the Newfoundland would perish during those 2 nights on the ice. Their suffering was unimaginable, their deaths slow and cruel. Yet the true horror was not just in the numbers but in the knowledge that it might have been prevented. Had there been a wireless set aboard the Newfoundland, had the men been recalled earlier, had the storm been respected rather than challenged, most would have lived. Instead, they froze in one of the most haunting maritime tragedies in history, remembered by their families as men abandoned to the cold. The survivors who staggered back were forever scarred. Some lost fingers and toes to frostbite, others entire limbs. Many never spoke of what they endured, their silence a testament to trauma too heavy for words. Those who did describe it painted pictures of horror, the sound of groans fading into stillness, the sight of friends frozen in their final moments, the endless night when hope itself seemed to die. The memory of those days never left them, etched into their souls as deeply as the frostbite into their flesh. The story of the men stranded on the ice is not just a tale of nature's cruelty. It is a story of abandonment, of poor decisions made by those who valued profit over lives, of an industry that demanded sacrifice until sacrifice became slaughter. The men of the Newfoundland paid the ultimate price, their bodies scattered across the floes, their names whispered in grief across Newfoundland's villages. Their suffering would shake the island to its core, but at that moment, as they froze beneath an uncaring sky, they were simply men left to die on the ice. The storm had raged for nearly 2 days before the winds finally weakened, leaving behind a bleak and deadly silence. On the ship Newfoundland, the men who remained aboard strained their eyes across the frozen expanse, searching for signs of their companions. But the ice stretched endlessly, a barren and deceptive landscape, masking the truth beneath its stillness. Those left on the ship knew something was wrong. Too many men had not returned, too many hours had passed. Whispers ran among the crew that those sent out had been lost to the storm. The officers offered little comfort, and the absence of a wireless set meant no message could be sent to neighboring ships for help. It was a void of communication, and into that void, human lives had already been swallowed. The first rescue efforts were clumsy, delayed by confusion and poor leadership. A group was dispatched across the ice, stumbling toward where the sealing crews had last been seen. The snow was littered with seal carcasses and scattered pelts, evidence of the furious hunt that had preceded the storm. But the men themselves were gone. The searchers called into the wind, their voices carried uselessly across the frozen sea. What they found instead were bodies. Dozens of them. Some lay face down in the snow, frozen mid-stride. Others were huddled in clusters, locked in deathly embraces, their final attempt at warmth etched into their stiffened forms. The survivors encountered were not much better than the dead. They staggered across the ice with faces blackened by frostbite, hands curled into claws where the flesh had frozen solid. Their eyes were glassy, their words slurred, their minds dulled by hypothermia. Some were too weak to speak at all. They simply collapsed when approached, barely alive, their breathing shallow. For the rescuers, the scene was like stepping into a nightmare. These were men they had eaten and joked with just days before, now reduced to living ghosts stumbling through a frozen graveyard. Back aboard the Newfoundland, those who survived were brought below deck. The ship's cramped quarters filled with the moans of frostbitten men, their suffering echoing through the wooden hull. Limbs were stripped of frozen clothing, boots cut away. From feet that had turned black. The stench of rot mingled with the salt air, for frostbite was merciless. It killed the flesh long before it killed the man. Sailors who had marched proudly onto the ice just days earlier now lay helpless, their bodies mutilated by cold, their fates uncertain. The horror was not limited to the Newfoundland. Word of the disaster spread slowly, carried across the ice fields as ships encountered the drifting remnants of the lost crews. The Stefano, another sealing vessel, was among the first to realize the scope of the tragedy. When her men stumbled upon survivors, they were shocked at the scale of the suffering. Messages were relayed where possible, but the lack of wireless on many ships hampered coordination. Each vessel had to act independently, piecing together fragments of the disaster from the broken men they recovered. When the Bonaventure entered the scene, the tragedy became undeniable. This ship, better equipped and manned, found bodies strewn across the ice in numbers too great to ignore. The crew of the Bonaventure worked tirelessly, hauling corpses aboard, stacking them like cordwood on the deck. The survivors they encountered were scarcely distinguishable from the dead, carried below to be warmed and fed, their futures uncertain. The decks of the Bonaventure became a macabre tableau, the living moaning in agony below, the dead lying silent above, their frozen forms a grim testament to the hunt's cost. The task of retrieval was grueling. Men were lashed to sledges and dragged back across shifting ice. The dead were stiff and heavy, their bodies frozen into awkward positions that made transport difficult. Rescuers spoke of the eerie silence of the corpses, the way they seemed more like statues than men. Many could not bring themselves to look at the faces of the dead, fearing they might recognize a friend, a brother, or a neighbor. Yet the work continued, for the families back home demanded answers, and the dignity of the dead demanded their return. On the ice, the rescuers saw sights that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. One group of men was found frozen in a circle, their arms around each other, as if in prayer. Another man was discovered standing upright, his gaff still in hand, his body locked in the act of moving forward. Entire groups had lain down together, their final moments spent in silence, waiting for death to take them. Each recovery told its own story of desperation and despair, and together they painted a picture of unimaginable suffering. The survivors who returned to the ships were not safe from tragedy. Many had severe frostbite that required amputations. Fingers, toes, hands, and feet were lost in makeshift surgeries performed with limited medical supplies. Some men never recovered, their bodies too ravaged by exposure. Infection set in quickly, and death followed even in the relative safety of the ship. The moans of men enduring amputations without proper anesthesia mingled with the cries of grief for those who had not survived. The ice had claimed them, but the aftermath continued to claim more. When the ships finally returned to St. John's, the scale of the tragedy was laid bare. News of the disaster spread like wildfire across the city. Families crowded the docks, desperate for news, scanning the faces of the survivors as they staggered ashore. But for many, their loved ones did not return alive. Instead, bodies were unloaded in grim processions, laid out for identification. Mothers, wives, and children wept openly, their grief mingling with anger. The sight of so many dead men, brought back from the hunt that was supposed to sustain them, shook Newfoundland to its core. The rescue efforts had done what they could, but they had been hampered from the very beginning, by negligence, by greed, by the absence of simple safety measures like wireless communication. The ships did their best to recover what was left of the sealing crews, but the damage was already done. In total, 78 men were dead, and dozens more would carry the scars of frostbite for the rest of their lives. The tragedy was one of the worst in Newfoundland's history, and its images, of frozen corpses on the ice, of bodies stacked on ship decks, of families wailing on the docks, would never be forgotten. The rescue, then, was not a moment of triumph but one of grim necessity. It salvaged what it could from the wreckage of human lives and brought the survivors home, but it could not undo the suffering, nor could it erase the failures that had allowed it to happen. The men of the Newfoundland had been abandoned on the ice, and though some had been saved, the stain of the disaster could not be washed away. The rescue efforts were the final act in a tragedy written by hubris, negligence, and the merciless cruelty of the North Atlantic. When the ships finally limped back into St. John's, they did not carry triumph, nor the riches of a successful sealing season. Instead, they bore a cargo of grief. Word of the disaster had traveled ahead of them, carried in whispers through the streets, spreading like wildfire across every alley and wharf of the city. By the time the Bellaventure and the Newfoundland docked, the waterfront was lined with thousands of anxious faces. Mothers clutched children against their skirts, wives strained to see over the crowd, fathers stood silent with hats in hand. They searched desperately for their men, sons, brothers, husbands, hoping against hope that they would walk down the gangplank alive. The sight that met them was unbearable. Survivors staggered ashore, many carried on stretchers, their bodies mutilated by frostbite. Some had lost fingers and toes, others entire hands or feet, the blackened flesh already rotting. These were men who had gone to sea in the prime of life, now returned as broken shadows. Their eyes were hollow, their skin blistered, their movements slow and pained. For families, the relief of seeing a loved one alive was quickly tempered by the horror of seeing what the ice had done to them. And then came the dead. Bodies were unloaded in grim processions, row after row, each wrapped in canvas or burlap. They were carried from the ships to temporary morgues, laid out in long, cold rows. The families pressed forward, desperate to look, desperate to know. Identification was a brutal process. Wives pulled back coverings with trembling hands, searching faces stiffened by frost, some distorted beyond recognition. Children clung to mothers as they looked upon fathers frozen in death, their features locked forever in expressions of suffering. The wailing filled the streets, a chorus of grief that echoed through St. John's and beyond. Newfoundland was a small colony at the time, and nearly every family was touched by the tragedy. Entire communities lost multiple men. In some villages, half the male population was gone, leaving behind widows and orphans with no means of support. Breadwinners had vanished overnight, and with them, the fragile stability of countless households. Grief was compounded by fear. Without these men, how would families survive the next winter? How would children be fed, debts repaid, roofs repaired? The sealing voyage that was meant to sustain life had instead ripped it away. The emotional toll was matched by an economic one. The sealing industry had always been dangerous, but it had also been necessary. Men did not go to the ice for glory. They went because wages from the hunt paid debts, bought food, and provided the small comforts of survival in a harsh land. Now, with 78 men dead and many more maimed, families faced destitution. Widows who had never worked outside the home were forced to take in laundry, sewing, or whatever scraps of work they could find. Children left school early to labor in fields or fisheries, replacing fathers who would never return. Poverty, already a constant shadow in Newfoundland, deepened in the wake of the disaster. Communities responded as best they could. Churches held memorials, their pews filled to bursting with mourners. Ministers spoke of sacrifice, of the dangers of the sea, of the need for faith in the face of tragedy. Yet even the words of Scripture could not soften the bitterness that many felt. Families asked the same questions. Why had their men been sent onto the ice in such conditions? Why had the ship no wireless to call for help? Why had no earlier rescue been launched? The grief that filled the churches was laced with anger, simmering just beneath the hymns and prayers. The funerals themselves were haunting affairs. Coffins were carried through narrow streets, followed by processions of weeping families. Bells tolled endlessly, marking not just individual deaths but the scale of collective loss. In some towns, multiple funerals were held on the same day, entire communities gathering to bury fathers and sons together. The ground was still frozen, making burials difficult, and gravediggers worked tirelessly to carve spaces in the earth. Each mound of fresh soil represented a life cut short, each wooden marker a reminder of the price paid on the ice. For the survivors, life did not return to normal. Many bore lifelong scars, both physical and emotional. Amputees struggled to adapt to a world that offered little help for the disabled. They could no longer fish, no longer work the land, no longer provide as they once had. Some turned to drink, drowning their memories in rum. Others withdrew entirely, haunted by visions of frozen companions and the endless, howling storm. They carried survivors' guilt, tormented by the question of why they had lived while others had died. Their families, though grateful, often felt the strain of caring for broken men, both bodies and spirits maimed by the ice. The psychological toll rippled outward. Children grew up in the shadow of the disaster, their lives defined by absence. They were the sons and daughters of dead sealers, marked by grief from the earliest years. Their mothers, worn down by labor and loss, carried grief as a permanent weight. Communities spoke of the disaster for generations, passing the story down as both warning and wound. The loss was not a single moment in history but a scar that shaped Newfoundland's identity, a reminder of the thin line between survival and catastrophe in a place ruled by the sea. The government and press responded quickly, though not always with compassion. Newspapers printed stark headlines, cataloguing the dead, the wounded, the survivors. Lists of names filled the pages, each one a story of a family broken. Editorials demanded accountability, calling for safety reforms, for wireless communication on ships, for better oversight of the sealing industry. Yet for families, such promises offered little comfort. No regulation could replace a father. No inquiry could erase the memories of those long nights on the ice. Still, the tragedy forced Newfoundland to confront the human cost of the sealing industry. Communities that had once accepted danger as inevitable now began to question whether it was acceptable to send men into such conditions with so little protection. The sealers' suffering became a rallying point for change, though change came slowly, weighed down by the island's poverty and dependence on the hunt. For many families, the reforms came too late. Their men were gone, their lives forever altered. In the end, the toll on families and communities was immeasurable. It was counted in coffins and amputations, in widows' tears and children's empty bellies, in the silence left at kitchen tables where a father once sat a day. The disaster was not only a maritime tragedy, it was a domestic one, played out in every home that lost a man to the ice. Newfoundland as a whole mourned, but it was in the quiet grief of its villagers, in the resilience of its widows, and in the haunted eyes of its survivors that the true cost was written. The ice had claimed 78 men, but it had also reshaped the lives of hundreds more, leaving scars that no thaw could ever melt. The disaster of 1912 did not end on the ice. The bodies were brought home, the funerals held, and the widows left to grieve, but grief quickly turned to fury. Newfoundland was a small colony where almost everyone knew someone who had been lost, and the scale of the catastrophe was impossible to ignore. The names of the 78 dead were read aloud in churches and printed in newspapers. Their faces stared out from photographs tacked to front pages, their families weeping in the streets. The people of Newfoundland demanded answers. How had so many men been abandoned on the ice? Why had no help come? Why had the Newfoundland sailed without a wireless set, when such equipment had already proven its worth on other ships? The outrage was immediate and widespread. Newspapers filled with editorials condemning the negligence of the sealing industry. Headlines spoke of needless slaughter and avoidable tragedy. Journalists pointed fingers at shipowners and captains alike, accusing them of valuing profit over human life. The stories printed were relentless. Vivid descriptions of frozen corpses stacked on the decks of the Bellaventure, first-hand accounts of survivors who spoke of the blizzard, the blindness, the groans of dying men. Each article poured fuel on the fire of public anger. In the homes of the bereaved, the outrage was deeply personal. Widows demanded to know why their husbands had been sent out onto the ice in worsening weather, why orders had driven them farther and farther from the safety of the ship. Fathers asked why their sons had been risked for pelts and pennies. Children asked questions that no one could answer. Rumors circulated that the officers of the Newfoundland had ignored warnings of an approaching storm, that they had been more concerned with the ship's catch than with the safety of their men. Whether true or not, the accusations spread quickly, and with them, the demand for accountability. The colony's government could not ignore the anger. Public meetings were called, petitions circulated, and speeches made in the legislature. The disaster was too large, too raw, to be buried in silence. Pressure mounted until officials announced what the people demanded: an official inquiry into the sealing disaster of 1912. The inquest was to determine who was responsible, what had gone wrong, and how such a calamity might be prevented in the future. It was both a pursuit of justice and a political necessity, a way for the government to show that it was listening to its grieving citizens. The inquest convened in St. John's in April, just weeks after the tragedy. Families crowded the courthouse, their faces etched with grief and fury. The proceedings became a kind of public theatre, with lawyers, captains, and shipowners all called to account. Witnesses gave testimony under oath, their words recorded in meticulous detail. Survivors described their ordeal, how they had been ordered farther onto the ice, how the storm had struck with sudden violence, how they had huddled together in desperation as night fell. They spoke of watching friends freeze to death beside them, of hallucinations, of hopelessness. Each story deepened the sense of horror, each detail driving home the avoidable nature of the disaster. The officers of the Newfoundland faced the harshest scrutiny. Captain Westbury Keane, son of the legendary sealer Captain Abraham Keane, was grilled about his decisions. Why had the men been sent so far across unstable ice? Why had no recall been sounded as the weather worsened? Why had the ship no wireless, when the technology was readily available? The answers were evasive. Some blamed bad luck, others the unpredictable nature of the ice, others still the absence of precise weather forecasts. But to the grieving families, these explanations sounded hollow. The absence of a wireless radio became the centerpiece of the inquiry. Other ships in the hunt had carried wireless sets, allowing them to communicate with one another and with stations on land. Had the Newfoundland been similarly equipped, rescue efforts could have been launched sooner. The storm's dangers could have been relayed, and the men recalled before it was too late. The lack of wireless was not an oversight. However, it was a choice. The ship's owners had refused to install one, deeming the cost unnecessary. That decision, motivated by profit, had condemned dozens of men to death. The revelation outraged the public and was splashed across headlines. The men had died because of greed. The inquest also revealed the chaotic and unregulated nature of the sealing industry itself. Crews were pushed to exhaustion, scattered across vast distances in search of pelts. Safety protocols were minimal, oversight non-existent. Each captain operated with near total autonomy, driven by competition and profit. In such an environment, it was only a matter of time before disaster struck. The inquiry painted a picture of an industry that was not merely dangerous but reckless, gambling with men's lives in pursuit of quotas. Families listened as officials debated reforms, but for many, the proceedings offered little solace. They wanted justice, yet it was unclear how justice could be delivered. No one man could be blamed for the storm. The ice, the wind, the sea, all were part of the tragedy. But the systemic failures, the greed of owners, the absence of safety measures, the lack of accountability, were undeniable. The inquest concluded that the disaster had been preventable, that negligence and poor judgment had contributed to the deaths. Yet those responsible faced no criminal charges. The verdict outraged the public once more. To many, it felt like another betrayal. Men had died, families had been broken, and yet the powerful walked away unpunished. The owners of the Newfoundland continued to operate, the captains retained their reputations, and the system remained largely intact. Though recommendations were made, wireless sets on ships, stricter safety protocols, the reforms came slowly, resisted by those with financial interests. The inquiry had exposed the truth, but truth alone could not undo the injustice. Still, the inquest was not without impact. The disaster and its aftermath seared themselves into Newfoundland's collective memory. The outrage it sparked fueled calls for reform that would eventually reshape the sealing industry. Wireless radios became standard, and the government took a more active role in regulating voyages. The suffering of the sealers of 1912 became a rallying cry for change, though at a cost too heavy to ever be justified. For the families who crowded the courthouse, however, the inquest was a hollow victory. They returned to their homes with no husbands, no sons, no fathers. Their grief remained, their questions unanswered. They had watched their tragedy turned into testimony, their loved ones reduced to names in a ledger. The system that had failed them continued, and the sea would claim more lives in the years to come. The public outrage surrounding the 1912 disaster was more than a moment of anger. It was a reflection of a colony, grappling with the true cost of survival in a harsh land. It was the voice of the poor demanding accountability from the powerful, the cry of families who refused to let their men be forgotten. The inquest may not have delivered justice in the way they desired, but it ensured that the tragedy of the Newfoundland sealers would never be silenced. Their frozen bodies on the ice became evidence not just of nature's cruelty, but of human failure, negligence, and greed. and the outrage they inspired ensured that, for once, those failures could not simply be ignored. The sealing disaster of 1912 did not end with the funerals, nor with the inquest that laid blame but offered little justice. Its true legacy stretched far beyond the ice, weaving itself into the fabric of Newfoundland's history, its politics, and its identity. The 78 men who froze on the floes became more than victims. They became symbols of both the brutal realities of survival in the North Atlantic and the terrible price of neglect. The tragedy reshaped how Newfoundlanders thought of the sea, the hunt, and themselves. Even today, over a century later, their story remains one of the defining episodes in the island's collective memory. In the years immediately following the disaster, the outcry forced change. The inquiry had revealed the scandal of the Newfoundland sailing without wireless communication, a cost-saving measure that doomed dozens of men. Public anger was too strong to be ignored, and soon after, regulations were passed requiring ships to carry wireless sets. This reform alone marked a turning point in maritime safety, not only in the sealing fleet but across the North Atlantic. In an era when the sea could still cut off entire communities, wireless communication became a lifeline. The men who died on the ice did not perish in vain. Their sacrifice forced a technology once considered optional into necessity. Yet reforms were slow and incomplete. The sealing industry remained dangerous, and tragedies continued. Just 2 years later, in 1914, Newfoundland was struck by another maritime catastrophe, the sinking of the SS Southern Cross, which vanished with 173 men aboard. The same season also witnessed the SS Newfoundland disaster, when more than 70 men were lost to another storm on the ice. The echoes of 1912 reverberated in these events, convincing many that the industry itself was cursed. But the truth was starker. The hunt was inherently perilous, and systemic neglect had left its workers exposed to dangers they could not control. The legacy of 1912 was not just reform but the grim reminder that change was often purchased with blood. Culturally, the disaster left an indelible mark. In villages across Newfoundland, stories of the lost sealers were passed down through generations. Children grew up hearing the names of uncles and grandfathers who had never returned. Songs were composed, poems written, sermons delivered, each retelling the suffering of the men on the ice. The disaster entered Newfoundland's oral tradition, becoming part of its folklore. In kitchens and church halls, families remembered not only the horror but the endurance of the survivors, the stubborn will to live against impossible odds. To forget was unthinkable. To remember was a duty. The disaster also exposed, in stark terms, the brutal class divisions of early 20th century Newfoundland. The men who died were poor laborists, drawn from fishing villages where poverty was endemic. They had gone to the ice not by choice but by necessity, driven by hunger and debt. The owners of the sealing vessels, by contrast, were wealthy merchants who lived far from the flows. They risked nothing but capital, while the men risked everything. The absence of wireless on the Newfoundland was a decision made by owners who valued profit over safety. That truth became part of the tragedy's legacy, a symbol of how the powerful exploited the poor, leaving them to die in service of commerce. For many, the disaster was not simply an act of God, it was a man-made atrocity born of greed. This perception fueled political consequences. Newfoundland's government, already under scrutiny for its handling of the fishery and its dependence on maritime industries, was forced to reckon with the growing discontent of its people. The 1912 disaster gave ordinary Newfoundlanders a voice, amplifying their demands for reforms, protections, and accountability. While systemic change was slow, the outrage planted seeds of resistance to the unchecked authority of merchants and ship owners. It revealed the cracks in a society built on exploitation, cracks that would widen in the decades to come as Newfoundland struggled with economic collapse and eventual confederation with Canada. On a more intimate level, the legacy was carved into the lives of survivors and their families. Men who returned from the ice often lived the rest of their lives with missing fingers, toes, or limbs. They became visible reminders of the tragedy, their bodies scarred by frostbite, their movements slowed by disability. In villages where work was hard and physical, these men often could no longer provide for their families. Some lived in quiet poverty, dependent on the charity of neighbors. Others carried invisible wounds, nightmares, hallucinations, and memories of the storm. In modern terms, we might call it post-traumatic stress, but in 1912, there was no such language. There was only silence, a silence that haunted households for generations. The widows and orphans, too, bore the legacy. Many women were forced into labor they had never imagined, taking in laundry, mending clothes, or working in service just to feed their children. Some children grew up half-starved, their futures curtailed by the absence of a father's wages. Others carried bitterness into adulthood, resenting the system that had taken their families from them. The legacy of the disaster was not only historical, it was lived in kitchens where meals were smaller, in schools where children dropped out early, in homes where grief lingered like a permanent guest. Over time, the story of the sealers became more than personal tragedy. It became a parable for Newfoundland's relationship with the sea, one of dependence, danger, and loss. The island's history is littered with shipwrecks, drownings, and maritime disasters, but the 1912 sealing tragedy stood out for its sheer brutality and scale. The image of men frozen in the ice, huddled together in death, became a haunting emblem of the price of survival in the North Atlantic. It reminded Newfoundlanders that the sea, for all its bounty, demanded sacrifices that could never be repaid. Today, more than a century later, the legacy endures. Memorials have been erected to honor the dead. Their names are inscribed in stone, ensuring they are not forgotten. Historians and writers continue to revisit the tragedy, examining its causes and its consequences. Each retelling ensures that the men of 1912 remain present in the cultural memory of Newfoundland. They are remembered not only as victims but as symbols of endurance, of the harsh realities of life on the edge of the North Atlantic, and of the human cost of neglect. The sealing disaster of 1912 is more than a story from the past. It is a mirror held up to questions still relevant today: the balance between profit and safety, the responsibilities of employers to their workers, the human cost of industries built on exploitation. It forces us to ask what lessons we have learned, and what lessons we continue to ignore. The men who froze in the ice cannot speak, but their silence is eloquent. It warns us of what happens when greed outweighs compassion, when communication is ignored, when the poor are treated as expendable. Ultimately, the legacy of the disaster is one of remembrance. It is carried in the names etched on monuments, in the stories whispered by descendants, in the haunting photographs of frozen men brought back from the ice. It is a reminder that history is not distant. It lives on in the scars of communities, in the resilience of survivors, and in the demands of those who refuse to forget. The men of the Newfoundland sealing disaster left behind more than grief. They left behind a warning, etched into ice and memory, that still chills us today. The story of the Newfoundland sealing disaster of 1912 is not simply an event locked away in history books. It continues to haunt us, lingering in cultural memory, in the frozen imagery of men huddled together against the storm, in the unanswered questions of justice and survival. Some tragedies fade with time, reduced to statistics or dusty records. Others become myth, larger than the sum of their facts, carrying a weight of symbolism that transcends the moment itself. The sealers who froze in the ice belong firmly to the latter. Their deaths were not only a disaster, they became a metaphor for human fragility, for greed, for endurance, and for the unforgiving nature of the world they inhabited. This is why the story still chills us more than a century later. One reason the tragedy continues to resonate lies in its sheer imagery. Few disasters are so visually arresting. Dozens of men scattered across an endless white horizon, blinded by snow, their bodies freezing where they fell. Survivors later describe how, at dawn, they awoke to find their companions stiff and lifeless beside them, their faces frozen into final expressions of terror, agony, or peace. Some groups were discovered huddled together, locked in embraces that death had made permanent. Others died alone, separated from their comrades, their bodies half buried in snowdrifts. When the rescue ship finally arrived, the bodies were not merely dead, they were grotesque. Frozen sculptures of suffering. Newspapers that published these accounts ensured that the images would never leave the public imagination. Even now, reading those testimonies feels like staring at a nightmare captured in ice. The haunting power of the event also comes from its contradictions. The sealers went to the ice as part of a centuries-old tradition. For generations, sealing had been portrayed as heroic, even noble, an act of bravery where men wrested survival from the jaws of nature. Yet here, the same tradition revealed itself to be merciless, a system that could turn against the very men it relied on. The disaster forced Newfoundlanders to reckon with this duality. The hunt was both a source of pride and a source of death. That tension still lingers in the cultural memory of the island, where sealing remains a subject of debate, pride, and shame. There is also something universally human in the story. The sealers of 1912 were not explorers or soldiers. They were ordinary working men, fathers, brothers, sons, who had gone to sea to earn a wage. Their suffering was not the consequence of daring adventure, but of necessity. They died not because they sought glory, but because poverty gave them no other choice. This reality makes the tragedy even more haunting. It could have been any man, from any small community, forced onto the ice by hunger. Their deaths stand as a stark reminder of how often the poor are sacrificed in the service of profit, how lives are gambled by those who risk nothing themselves. That imbalance, between owners and workers, wealth and poverty, remains as relevant today as it was in 1912. The ice itself plays a symbolic role in why the disaster refuses to fade. Ice is merciless, a force of nature that embodies silence and inevitability. Unlike fire, which consumes with noise and chaos, ice kills slowly, invisibly. It numbs, stiffens, and steals life in cruel increments. The image of men freezing in a blizzard, unable to see, unable to move, encapsulates one of the most primal human fears, being swallowed by the cold. For cultures that live in northern climates, where winter dominates the year, the symbolism of death by freezing carries an especially chilling weight. It is not a distant fear. It is close, familiar, intimate. The disaster therefore becomes not just a historical event but a dark allegory for human struggle against winter itself. Memory also plays its part. In Newfoundland, the disaster entered folklore almost immediately. Songs and poems kept the story alive, ensuring that even children who had not been born in 1912 grew up knowing of the men who froze in the ice. Each retelling gave the story new power, transforming it into something larger than fact. With each generation, the tragedy became less about the precise details and more about the enduring themes of sacrifice, neglect, and survival. When a story persists like this, it ceases to belong solely to history. It becomes cultural myth. And myths, unlike facts, never fade. The haunting quality is also intensified by the lack of closure. The inquest exposed negligence but delivered no true justice. The owners who failed to equip their ships with wireless radios faced no punishment. The captains who made questionable decisions returned to sea. The families who demanded accountability received only sympathy. The absence of justice left the disaster unresolved, a wound that never healed. Unresolved tragedies linger in ways resolved ones do not. They leave behind questions, accusations, and a sense of betrayal that refuses to dissipate. For many Newfoundlanders, the 1912 disaster still feels like a betrayal, and betrayal is a memory that never leaves. On a broader scale, the story haunts us because it reflects something universal about human ambition and fragility. We are reminded that even in the 20th century, with technology advancing and societies modernizing, people could still be abandoned to die in ways that seemed medieval. The disaster revealed that progress is fragile, that even small decisions, like refusing to install a wireless set, can mean the difference between life and death. It forces us to confront the uncomfortable truth that humanity often learns only through catastrophe, and even then, the lessons come too late. Psychologically, the story endures because it touches on themes of endurance and futility. Survivors spoke of men who kept walking long after they could no longer feel their limbs, who sang hymns in the storm, who clung to one another in desperation. There is both horror and inspiration in these details. Horror at the suffering, inspiration at the refusal to surrender. But the futility of it, the fact that endurance was not enough, that willpower could not overcome the cold, makes the tragedy all the more haunting. It is a reminder of human limits, of the point where courage meets inevitability. Finally, the disaster haunts us because it embodies the timeless tension between man and nature. The men who died on the ice were caught in a confrontation as old as humanity itself, the struggle to survive against an environment that does not care whether we live or die. Nature is indifferent, and in that indifference lies terror. The storm that struck in 1912 did not come with malice. It came because storms come. The ice did not kill because it was cruel. It killed because that is what ice does. The sealers' deaths remind us that. Nature is not an enemy but an unyielding reality, one we can neither negotiate with nor escape. That truth is haunting precisely because it is eternal. The legacy of the Newfoundland sealing disaster endures not only in history but in symbolism, memory, and myth. It is a story that continues to chill because it is more than a list of names or a maritime accident. It is a reflection of who we are, what we fear, and what we fail to change. The men who froze in the ice remain with us, not just as lost souls of 1912 but as reminders of human fragility, of the cruelty of neglect, and of the mercilessness of winter. That is why, even today, the story is not forgotten. It still haunts us, as it always will. The Newfoundland sealing disaster of 1912 closes like a ghost story, one that refuses to rest. More than a century has passed, yet the men who froze on the ice still whisper to us from across the years. Their tragedy was more than a maritime accident, more than an industrial failure, more than a storm. It was a convergence of greed, neglect, desperation, and the indifferent cruelty of nature. And as we step back to view the full arc of this haunting story, the conclusion is not simply about the past. It is about the warnings history leaves behind, frozen in time like the bodies recovered from the flows. The 78 men who perished were not nameless figures in a textbook. They were flesh and blood, fathers, sons, brothers, neighbors. Each had a story before the storm, and each left a story behind. Their lives were woven into the fabric of Newfoundland's small, tight-knit communities, and when they vanished into the blizzard, they left behind more than grief. They left voids, empty places at kitchen tables, missing voices in the fishing boats, silences in church pews. These absences shaped villages for decades. The memory of the dead was carried not only in public monuments, but in the quiet rituals of families who continued to speak their names. The conclusion of their story is not death. It is endurance, memory, and a legacy of sorrow that never loosened its grip. As we reflect on the events, the themes emerge with chilling clarity. One is the brutal indifference of nature. The storm that swept the ice fields was unstoppable, unpredictable, and merciless. It reminded everyone that the sea gives but also takes, and that the North Atlantic, so central to Newfoundland's survival, could just as easily be its executioner. Nature has always humbled humanity, but in this case it exposed the futility of human ambition against forces far beyond our control. To walk into a blizzard on the ice was to stand at the edge of existence, and the men of 1912 paid the price for underestimating just how fragile the line between life and death truly is. But nature alone was not to blame. If storms cannot be controlled, decisions can. The absence of a wireless radio, the reckless drive for more pelts, the failure to prioritize safety over profit, these were human choices. Choices that transformed a dangerous situation into a massacre. That is what makes this story so unsettling. The realization that the disaster did not have to happen. Greed disguised as pragmatism condemned men to die. The refusal of owners to spend money on technology already proven to save lives revealed a chilling truth, that in the eyes of some, profit outweighed people. And when those decisions are stripped bare by hindsight, we see the outlines of a man-made disaster, one more horrifying than any storm. The inquiry that followed confirmed what the grieving already knew. Negligence had played its part. Yet accountability was elusive, justice diluted. The men at the top carried on, the system endured, and the poor returned to the ice season after season. That unresolved injustice lingers like frost in the story's conclusion, a reminder that power often shields itself while the powerless pay the price. In this way, the 1912 sealing disaster was not just a maritime tragedy but a parable about inequality, a story of how easily the vulnerable are sacrificed when their lives are measured in dollars. Another theme that emerges is resilience. Though many died, others survived, carrying scars both visible and invisible. Their survival speaks to a raw willpower that defies comprehension. Men who walked blinded, who clung to life when their bodies were little more than frozen shells, who huddled together through 2 endless nights on the ice. All of this speaks to the human instinct to endure against impossible odds. Their survival stories are as haunting as the deaths, because they remind us of the razor-thin line between chance and fate, between those who lived and those who did not. The long shadow of the tragedy also shaped Newfoundland itself. It forced reforms, inspired cultural memory, and left a warning etched deep in the collective consciousness. To this day, the disaster is remembered not just as history but as identity, a reminder of the island's harsh realities, its reliance on the sea, and the costs of survival. It is no accident that songs, stories, and memorials keep the memory alive. To remember is to honor, but it is also to learn. The sealers' frozen bodies were not only victims, they became teachers, a permanent reminder that safety, accountability, and compassion must come before profit. Why does this story still matter? Because its themes are timeless. The balance between risk and reward, the vulnerability of laborious in dangerous industries, the temptation of owners to cut costs at the expense of safety, these issues did not end in 1912. They remain alive in mines, on oil rigs, in factories, and in shipping lanes today. The frozen sealers warn us of what happens when warnings go unheeded, when greed blinds responsibility, when systems fail to protect those who risk everything. Their story is not simply about Newfoundland. It is about humanity's recurring struggle to value life over profit, compassion over convenience. In the final accounting, the The 1912 disaster offers both horror and warning. Horror, in the unimaginable suffering of men trapped on the floes, their cries drowned in the storm. Warning, in the consequences of neglect and greed, and in the reminder that tragedies repeat when lessons are ignored. That duality, suffering and warning, ensures the story will never truly fade. It will always haunt, because it speaks to the deepest truths of survival, responsibility, and the fragility of life. The frozen warning of 1912 still whispers to us. It speaks through the photographs of corpses stacked on decks, through the testimonies of survivors, through the silence of names carved into stone. It speaks not only of the men who died, but of the world that failed them. And as long as the sea remains part of human life, as long as industries push workers into danger, as long as decisions value profit above people, the warning will remain relevant. The men who froze in the ice cannot return. But their story can. And it does, each time we tell it, each time we remember. In their silence, they left us a message more enduring than any words. Never forget what happens when we treat human lives as expendable. Their frozen bodies are gone, but their warning remains. Cold, eternal, undeniable. The year was 1908, and the world was standing at a fragile threshold between tradition and modernity. Across Europe, rapid industrialization had transformed cities into hubs of steel and smoke. Telegraph wires crisscrossed continents, connecting capitals with a speed unimaginable a century earlier. In the laboratories of Paris, Berlin, and London, the foundations of modern physics were being laid. Radioactivity had been discovered just a decade earlier, and Albert Einstein had only recently introduced his theory of relativity. Humanity was learning to measure the invisible forces of the universe, yet vast stretches of the Earth remained untouched, mysterious, and poorly understood. Among the most impenetrable of these frontiers was Siberia, a wilderness so immense and so hostile that even within the borders of the Russian Empire it was spoken of with awe and dread. Russia itself was a country on edge. Tsar Nicholas II sat uneasily on the throne, presiding over an empire riddled with unrest. The revolution of 1905 had left scars that had not yet healed, and whispers of further upheaval travelled from village to village. Poverty and hunger plagued the countryside, while dissent simmered in the cities. In this climate of instability, Siberia existed almost as another world, a place to which criminals and dissidents were exiled, where settlers clung to life in tiny villages scattered across thousands of miles of taiga. The empire claimed it, but in truth, nature ruled it. Harsh winters, swamp-filled summers, and endless forests made Siberia a land that resisted taming. It was here, in this immense and isolated backdrop, that the Tunguska event would unfold. To most of the world, the area was little more than a blank spot on a map, a place associated with exile, mystery, and hardship. Few roads penetrated this land. Communication was slow, unreliable, and dangerous. The telegraph might connect St. Petersburg to Vladivostok, but for those living deep in the taiga, news traveled by word of mouth, sometimes taking months to reach neighboring communities. This remoteness ensured that whatever occurred on that June morning would not instantly reach the ears of scientists or officials. Unlike an earthquake in Japan or a volcanic eruption in Italy, the blast in Tunguska would remain, for years, a story carried only by the voices of those who survived it. Culturally, the Siberian wilderness was home to more than Russian settlers. Indigenous peoples such as the Evenki, Yakuts, and others had roamed these forests for centuries, living according to traditions rooted in animism and shamanism. To them, the natural world was alive with spirits, and the sky was a realm of both guidance and wrath. Every unusual flash of light, every distant rumble of thunder, carried meaning. When the fireball streaked across the sky in 1908, many Evenki interpreted it not as a natural phenomenon, but as the punishment of a god angered by human transgressions. This worldview contrasted sharply with the growing secularism of Europe, where scientists sought mechanical, measurable causes for every event. In Tunguska, both of these perspectives would collide: spiritual awe and scientific curiosity, myth and measurement. Globally, the year was one of contradictions. The Wright brothers had flown their first airplane just 5 years earlier, marking the dawn of human aviation. At the same time, old empires were unraveling under the weight of modern politics and warfare. Colonial powers stretched themselves thin, and whispers of world conflict were already in the air. Few people outside Russia paid attention to the deep Siberian wilderness, but when reports of glowing skies and strange atmospheric disturbances began to circulate, newspapers in Europe and America printed sensational headlines. Yet without photographs or official confirmation, Many readers dismissed these stories as exaggerations or rural folklore. Science was advancing, but skepticism still reigned whenever stories came from places perceived as uncivilized or beyond the reach of modernity. To understand why the Tunguska blast remained so mysterious for so long, one must consider the limitations of the early 20th century. There were no satellites to track atmospheric explosions, no global seismographic networks capable of pinpointing events with accuracy. Radio communication was in its infancy. When the shockwaves rattled seismographs in London, it was noted as an anomaly but not connected to a specific cause. When skies glowed in Paris and Stockholm, the events were recorded as curiosities, unexplained and unlinked to anything in distant Siberia. The tools that would later allow scientists to unravel such a mystery simply did not exist. The political climate of Russia further obscured the event. The empire was more concerned with maintaining control than with exploring or documenting strange occurrences in remote provinces. Government officials paid little attention to reports trickling in from Siberian villages. Even if they had wanted to act, the logistical challenge of organizing an expedition into the heart of Tunguska would have been enormous. Travel by river was slow, overland transport nearly impossible for long distances, and winters sealed off much of the region entirely. In a nation already plagued by internal unrest, the mystery in the taiga was simply not a priority. And yet, despite the empire's indifference, stories spread. Merchants, trappers, and herders carried tales of the sky splitting in two, of forests flattened, of animals killed by unseen fire. These accounts reached larger towns and eventually seeped into the consciousness of urban Russia. They mingled with superstition, creating an atmosphere of dread and wonder. In some villages, people whispered that the end of the world had nearly come. Others claimed that a giant iron mass had fallen from heaven and buried itself in the earth. The further the stories traveled, the less consistent they became, but the more they fueled fascination. The world of 1908 was caught between two ways of understanding the unknown. On one hand, scientists in Europe sought to reduce every mystery to data, formulas, and natural law. On the other hand, the ordinary people of Siberia lived within a framework where the unknown was sacred, a place where gods and spirits still ruled. The Tunguska blast erupted at this crossroads, ensuring that from the very beginning it would be interpreted in contradictory ways. Was it a natural disaster, a cosmic accident, or a divine message? Looking back, the historical backdrop of 1908 is as essential to the Tunguska mystery as the explosion itself. The event occurred in a world not yet ready to record it properly, in a place almost designed to conceal its secrets. This combination of remoteness, political instability, cultural diversity, and scientific limitation meant that the Tunguska blast was destined to become more than just an explosion. It became a legend, a puzzle whose pieces would remain scattered for decades. By the time scientists finally arrived to study the site, history had already begun shaping Tunguska into one of the greatest enigmas of the modern age. In the days and weeks after June 30th, 1908, fragments of stories began to surface from the scattered inhabitants of the Siberian taiga. These accounts, carried by trappers, herders, and merchants, spoke of a morning unlike any other, of fire that streaked across the heavens, of thunder without clouds, of forests convulsing as if the earth itself were alive. The witnesses came from different villages and different cultures, but their recollections shared a haunting unity. Something vast and incomprehensible had descended from the sky. To piece together what happened, one must step into the shoes of those who lived through the moment, men and women whose words remain the closest thing we have to a direct view of the Tunguska blast. Among the first to describe the event were the Evenki, nomadic reindeer herders who roamed the remote expanses of central Siberia. One herder told of seeing a sudden flash, so bright that it seemed to pierce through his closed eyelids. Startled, he opened his eyes to find the entire horizon consumed by a ball of fire racing overhead. The heat was immediate, suffocating, as if the air itself had ignited. His reindeer bolted in panic, crashing through brush and tearing their harnesses. Moments later, a wave of pressure struck him, flinging him to the ground. He remembered the earth trembling, the trees groaning, and then silence, broken only by the cries of terrified animals. To him, there was no scientific explanation. This was anger from above, a punishment that defied human understanding. Another account came from a man named S. Semyonov, who lived in the village of Vanavara, about 40 miles from the epicenter. Sitting on his porch that morning, he saw the northern sky split apart by a blinding white light. The heat struck his face so violently that he thought his shirt might burst into flames. As he scrambled indoors, a shockwave blew out his windows and rattled the very frame of his house. Later, he would recall how the ground shook like an earthquake, how he was hurled against the wall by a force that seemed to come from nowhere. For days afterward, he was haunted by the brightness, the searing vision of a sun where no sun should be. Farther away, the event still left its mark. A postal worker in Karensk, more than 300 miles from Tunguska, reported hearing deafening booms that rolled across the sky in succession. Windows rattled, dishes toppled from shelves, and frightened villagers poured into the streets, convinced that a great war had begun. In towns even farther afield, strange atmospheric disturbances were noted. The sky glowed at night with eerie hues, and people spoke of being able to read outside at midnight under an unnatural brilliance. These distant witnesses did not see the fireball itself, but they felt its power, a reminder that the Tunguska blast was not a local curiosity but a continental event. For those closer to the epicenter, the memories were sharper, more visceral. Several Evenki families told of the morning hunt interrupted by a noise like cannon fire, followed by a rushing roar that seemed to come from inside the earth and the sky at once. Trees bent and snapped around them, and animals collapsed mid-stride. One shaman insisted that the blast was the manifestation of a god descending in fury, a vision of divine retribution for some forgotten sin. He pointed to the flattened forest as proof, an entire kingdom of trees laid low in an instant, as though brushed aside by a colossal hand. These accounts were often colored by fear and superstition, but they were consistent in one critical way. The phenomenon was sudden, overwhelming, and far beyond the scale of anything in living memory. The heat, the brightness, the concussive force, all were emphasized again and again. Some compared it to a second sun rising, others spoke of the sky opening up. Yet for all their vividness, these testimonies contained a frustrating detail for scientists who would later analyze them. No one had seen anything strike the ground. There was fire and light above, there was devastation below, but there was no crater, no impact site. The psychological impact of the event was profound. Survivors spoke of nightmares that lasted for years, dreams in which the sky would blaze and the earth would shake without warning. Hunters refused to travel into the blast zone, convinced that it remained cursed. Even decades later, when scientists arrived to survey the area, the locals were hesitant to approach, warning the explorers that they were venturing into the domain of an angry spirit. These lingering fears became part of the folklore of the region, weaving Tunguska into the oral traditions of the Evenki people as a sacred and terrifying chapter in their history. Outside Siberia, the eyewitness stories often sounded too fantastical to be believed. Newspapers in Moscow and St. Petersburg carried fragments of these accounts, but readers in the cities were skeptical. Tales of fireballs and divine wrath seemed more like fairy tales than news. Yet some reports were harder to ignore. Railway workers hundreds of miles away swore that the shockwave had knocked them off their feet. Hunters in remote camps described entire days lost to disorientation after being thrown unconscious by the blast. Accounts of trees set aflame without burning continued to circulate, adding a surreal edge to the growing mystery. Even decades later, when researchers interviewed elderly survivors, the trauma remained vivid. One man recalled that as a boy he had been tending to livestock when the sky exploded. The sound was so loud that he felt his ears might burst, and he saw birds drop lifeless from the air. He remembered the sensation of suffocating, as though the atmosphere itself had been pulled away, before being slammed to the ground by a force he could not name. These recollections, even softened by time, carried the raw edge of fear, a testimony to the magnitude of the event. From these scattered voices emerges a picture that is both clear and confounding. The Tunguska blast was an experience shared by thousands, yet no two stories were exactly alike. For some, it was a vision of divine punishment. For others, a fiery meteor tearing the sky. The core elements remained constant: light, heat, thunder, trembling, but the interpretation varied according to culture, belief, and distance from the epicenter. This mosaic of testimony would later provide scientists with vital clues, but in 1908, it only deepened the sense of dread and confusion. The eyewitnesses of Tunguska left us more than memories. They left a human connection to an otherwise alien event. Their fear, their awe, and their attempts to understand the incomprehensible remind us that history is not only about data or theories, it is about lived experience. The stories of those who saw the sky split apart remain the beating heart of the Tunguska mystery. And as we move deeper into the tale, these voices echo in the background, a reminder that what science would later dissect began as a moment of pure, human terror beneath a burning sky. When the sky finally quieted and the echoes of the great blast faded into the Siberian wilderness, what remained was a landscape transformed beyond recognition. In the heart of the taiga, Stretching across more than 2,000 square kilometers, 80 million trees had been torn from their roots or snapped like matchsticks. To stand in that forest after June 30th, 1908, would have been to stand amid a scene that looked less like the work of nature and more like the aftermath of some terrible war. The Tunguska blast had not only scarred the land, it had rewritten it. The destruction pattern itself was extraordinary. From the air, though no one would see it clearly until decades later, the forest lay flattened in a giant radial formation, like the spokes of a wheel emanating from a single invisible point. Trees pointed outward, all lying in the same direction, as though some titanic explosion had radiated from a center and swept everything before it. Yet in the very core of the devastation, the trees remained standing, their trunks charred and stripped of branches but rooted firmly in the ground, like blackened pillars marking the center of an invisible firestorm. To walk among them was to step into a paradox: devastation without an impact, destruction without a source. The sheer scale of the blast was unlike anything human eyes had seen before. Modern estimates suggest that the energy released was between 10 and 15 megatons of TNT, hundreds of times more powerful than the atomic bomb dropped on Hiroshima. The shockwaves circled the globe twice, and the atmospheric disturbances it generated lingered for weeks. Yet in 1908, those who stumbled into the devastated forest had no such calculations. What they saw was more visceral: a wilderness laid bare, trees stripped and splintered, animals dead where they had stood, and an eerie silence where once there had been the constant hum of the tiger. Survivors who dared to enter the blast zone described a scene of haunting strangeness. Trees had not burned in the way one might expect from a forest fire. Instead, many were scorched on one side, as if seared by a passing wave of heat, while others were peeled of their bark entirely. Branches had been ripped away, leaving skeletal trunks that reached into the sky. The ground was littered with debris, but there was no crater, no gaping wound in the earth to explain the violence. In places, patches of soil were blackened and barren, while nearby meadows remained untouched, a bizarre contrast that defied simple explanation. This contrast between obliteration and survival added to the mystery. Some remote cabins, though within the blast zone, were left standing, their occupants shaken but alive. In other areas farther from the epicenter, entire herds of reindeer had been killed instantly, their bodies lying lifeless across the tundra. The devastation did not follow the neat patterns of ordinary disaster. It was selective, almost arbitrary, as if some unseen force had chosen where to strike and where to spare. This unevenness gave rise to endless speculation among locals, who struggled to make sense of the destruction in spiritual terms. How could one family survive unscathed while their neighbors perished? To many, it seemed less like a natural event and more like the judgment of gods. For decades, the devastation lay largely unseen by the outside world. The remoteness of Tunguska meant that few people ventured into the ruined forest, and those who did often avoided the heart of the blast out of fear. The Evenki people, deeply shaken by what they had witnessed, considered the area cursed. They refused to hunt or camp there, warning outsiders that it was a place of death and bad spirits. The wilderness itself began to reclaim the scar, new growth pushing up among the fallen trunks, but the ghostly outlines of flattened trees remained for generations. When scientists finally arrived in the 1920s, they found the forest still marked with the radial pattern, as if time itself had frozen the moment of destruction into the land. The absence of a crater was the most confounding element of all. In disasters of this magnitude, the expectation was clear: a massive impact should have gouged a hole into the earth, leaving behind a scar as undeniable as the destruction around it. Yet in Tunguska, there was nothing. No crater, no fragment of a meteorite large enough to explain the energy released. This absence baffled researchers and gave fuel to countless theories. Some proposed that the object had disintegrated in midair, its energy released before touching the ground. Others argued that the evidence pointed not to an asteroid at all, but to something even stranger. Comparisons to modern events help frame the scale of Tunguska's devastation. The closest analogy came decades later, in 1945, when the world witnessed the obliteration of Hiroshima and Nagasaki by atomic bombs. Those who examined the photographs of Tunguska's flattened forest recognized a disturbing similarity: the radial blast pattern, the scorched trunks, the eerie silence in the aftermath. Yet Tunguska had occurred without human intervention, without the splitting of atoms. It was as if nature, or perhaps the cosmos, had performed its own nuclear test in the heart of Siberia, long before humanity had unlocked such destructive power. Despite the destruction, one detail stands out: no confirmed human deaths were officially recorded. This fact, while remarkable, is less a testament to luck than to geography. Tunguska was so remote, so sparsely populated, that entire villages lay dozens of miles apart. Had the blast occurred over Moscow, London, or New York, it would have killed hundreds of thousands instantly and leveled entire cities. The devastation of Tunguska was not merely an isolated tragedy, it was a chilling reminder of humanity's vulnerability. The Earth had been struck, and only chance had spared civilization from witnessing a catastrophe on an unimaginable scale. In the aftermath, as the years passed and memories faded, the scar in the forest remained as silent testimony. Even without photographs or scientific measurements from the time, the destruction spoke for itself. It was a message written in broken trees and scorched soil. Something vast had happened here, something powerful enough to alter the land itself. The devastation of Tunguska was both a wound and a warning, a reminder that the Earth is not a closed world but a fragile sphere adrift in a universe filled with forces far greater than ourselves. For an event of such staggering magnitude, it seems unthinkable that the world would simply look away. A blast powerful enough to shake the Earth, flatten millions of trees, and light up skies over Europe should have drawn armies of scientists, reporters, and government officials to Siberia within weeks. Yet the truth is that no organized investigation of the Tunguska explosion was mounted for nearly 2 decades. From 1908 until 1927, the blast zone remained untouched by systematic study, its secrets left to the silence of the taiga and the whispers of frightened villagers. Understanding why requires us to look not only at the remoteness of the Siberian wilderness, but also at the political and social upheavals that consumed Russia in the early 20th century. First, geography played its part. Tunguska lay in one of the most remote and inaccessible regions of the Russian Empire, hundreds of miles from the nearest railway line and deeper still from any city that might support a major scientific expedition. Travel into the area required weeks of dangerous trekking through swamp, forest, and rivers that froze solid in winter and flooded in spring. Communication was primitive. A telegraph line might transmit rumors to Moscow, but there were no detailed maps, no infrastructure to support researchers, and no incentive for officials to spend money on reaching a wilderness where only scattered indigenous families and a handful of settlers lived. To those in power, Tunguska was not a priority. It was an empty land, far from the empire's heart. Then came politics. Just 3 years before the Tunguska blast, Russia had suffered humiliation in the Russo-Japanese War, followed by the Revolution of 1905. The Tsar's government, already weakened, was struggling to maintain authority. Peasants were rioting, workers were striking, and revolutionaries plotted openly in cities. In this environment of unrest, a mysterious explosion in a distant forest barely registered in St. Petersburg. The empire's rulers were more concerned with keeping their throne intact than with investigating strange occurrences in Siberia. Whatever scraps of information did reach officials were dismissed as exaggerations or left to gather dust in minor reports. World events only compounded the neglect. By 1914, Europe was engulfed in the First World War, and Russia was consumed in battles that would cost millions of lives. Soldiers were dying on the Eastern Front, supplies were dwindling, and political turmoil was mounting. An expedition to Siberia to study a blast that had harmed no major cities and caused no official death toll was the last thing on anyone's mind. When the war ended in 1917, Russia collapsed into revolution and civil war. The Bolsheviks rose to power, the Romanovs were executed, and the nation descended into years of chaos. Entire regions broke away, armies clashed across the countryside, and famine stalked the land. In such a setting, the mystery of Tunguska all but vanished from public awareness. The land itself may have borne the scars, but the nation had far greater wounds to tend. The few reports that did circulate in these years were carried largely by traders, hunters, and the indigenous Evenki people, whose oral traditions preserve their terrifying memories of the blast. But these accounts rarely reached beyond Siberia. To city dwellers and scientists in Moscow or abroad, the story seemed like folklore, tales of angry gods, fire from the sky, or apocalyptic thunder. Without physical evidence or government initiative, the Tunguska event became more rumor than fact. It was remembered locally, but beyond the taiga, it slipped into obscurity. Even had scientists wished to investigate, they would have faced immense obstacles. Organizing an expedition required funding, manpower, and political support, all scarce in a nation unraveling under war and revolution. Moreover, the site itself was daunting. Summers in Tunguska brought clouds of biting insects and swampy terrain that swallowed men and horses alike. Winters plunged the land into impenetrable snow and sub-zero temperatures. To travel into the blast zone required not only willpower but the endurance to survive some of the harshest conditions on Earth. Few were willing to attempt it, and none succeeded until decades later. There was also fear. Among the Evenki, the area was considered cursed, a place of spirits and punishment. Hunters refused to enter, warning outsiders that the land was poisoned or haunted. For villagers, the memory of that morning was too raw, too terrifying to revisit. When outsiders asked for details, locals often spoke in hushed tones, reluctant to stir the wrath of the sky god again. This reluctance reinforced the silence surrounding Tunguska, making it harder for accurate accounts to travel outward. The event became both a sacred taboo and a fading memory, tucked away in the collective consciousness of a people who had learned to live in the shadow of nature's unpredictability. By the early 1920s, the Soviet Union had begun consolidating power, and with it came a renewed emphasis on science and exploration. Yet even then, it took time for the Tunguska blast to re-emerge in public awareness. Only in scattered scientific journals did a few curious researchers begin to revisit the reports. Among them was a mineralogist named Leonid Kulik, who would eventually dedicate his life to solving the mystery. But in 1908, and for nearly 20 years afterward, the site remained untouched by scientific eyes. The reasons were many: the remoteness of Siberia, the chaos of revolution and war, the lack of infrastructure, the disinterest of officials, and the fear of locals. Together, these forces conspired to bury Tunguska in silence. Had the blast occurred in Europe, North America, or near a major city, it would have been investigated. Immediately, its secrets likely revealed within years. Instead, it happened in a land that the world ignored, at a time when Russia was tearing itself apart. This long delay would prove both a curse and a gift. A curse, because valuable evidence decayed, memories faded, and countless questions went unanswered. But also a gift, because the untouched forest preserved the destruction as if frozen in time, waiting for the first daring expedition to arrive. When scientists finally set foot in the blast zone in the late 1920s, they would find not only devastation but also mystery, a riddle that had been waiting patiently in the Siberian wilderness for nearly 2 decades. In the story of Tunguska, there is one figure who stands above all others, a man whose obsession with a mysterious blast would consume the better part of his career and ultimately cement his place in history. His name was Leonid Alexeyevich Kulik, a Russian mineralogist whose determination to uncover the truth behind the event transformed the forgotten catastrophe into one of the greatest scientific mysteries of the 20th century. Without him, Tunguska might have remained nothing more than a half-remembered tale of fire in the sky, dismissed as folklore. With him, it became a global enigma. Kulik was not, at first glance, the heroic figure one might expect. Born in 1883, he was a man of contradictions, stubborn, driven, and often abrasive, yet also brilliant and unyielding in his pursuit of answers. He served in the Russo-Japanese War, where he was wounded and captured, and later fought in World War I. His time as a soldier hardened him, but it also left him restless. After the chaos of the Russian Revolution, he drifted into academia, working at the Mineralogical Museum in Moscow. It was here, in the early 1920s, that he stumbled across obscure reports of a colossal explosion in Siberia some 15 years earlier. The sparse accounts fascinated him. Stories of skies glowing over Europe, of forests flattened across vast distances, of frightened villagers describing fire from the heavens. It all pointed, in Kulik's mind, to a meteorite impact of unprecedented scale. At the time, Russia's scientific institutions were hungry for discoveries that could bolster the young Soviet Union's reputation as a leader in science. Kulik saw an opportunity. If he could find the remnants of the Tunguska meteorite, it would not only solve a mystery but also bring prestige to Soviet research. He began petitioning for support, writing tirelessly to institutions and government officials. Convincing the authorities, however, was no simple task. The Soviet Union in the 1920s was still reeling from civil war and famine. Resources were scarce, and scientific exploration was often tied directly to political usefulness. Why, officials asked, should they spend money to send a man into the Siberian wilderness to chase a rumor nearly 2 decades old? Kulik's answer was both pragmatic and visionary. If the Tunguska event was indeed caused by a meteorite, then its fragments might contain valuable metals, perhaps even new elements unknown to science. His argument carried the flavor of both resource exploitation and national pride, 2 values the Soviet leadership could support. In 1921, Kulik managed to join a small expedition into Siberia, though it did not reach the actual blast zone. Instead, he collected stories from locals, piecing together the first coherent narrative of the event. These interviews convinced him beyond doubt that Tunguska had been caused by an enormous meteorite or comet fragment exploding in the atmosphere. He returned to Moscow with renewed determination and pressed harder for a full expedition. Finally, in 1927, nearly 19 years after the explosion, Kulik's persistence paid off. He led the first official scientific team into the Tunguska region. What awaited him was a journey into one of the harshest landscapes on Earth. Siberia did not yield its secrets easily. The team traveled by train, riverboat, and horseback, enduring swarms of mosquitoes in the summer heat and navigating swamps that seemed to stretch without end. Kulik himself, already in his 40s, pushed on despite illness and exhaustion. His colleagues later recalled that his sheer willpower kept the expedition moving when others might have turned back. When the team finally reached the blast zone, the sight before them defied description. Even after 19 years, the devastation was unmistakable. Millions of trees lay flattened, radiating outward from the epicenter like the spokes of a wheel. In the very center, the trunks remained upright, stripped of branches, blackened and lifeless. Kulik and his men wandered among this ghost forest, stunned by its scale. For Kulik, it was both exhilarating and frustrating. The destruction clearly confirmed a massive explosion. But where was the crater? Kulik expected to find a giant impact site, perhaps a whole hundreds of meters wide, littered with fragments of iron or stone. Instead, he found nothing. The ground at the epicenter was marshy, dotted with small bogs and pools of stagnant water, but there was no sign of a meteorite. He scoured the area, digging into the soil, searching for metallic fragments. Days turned into weeks, but the hoped-for evidence never appeared. The absence of a crater bewildered him. How could such a cataclysmic event leave no scar? In the earth. Despite this disappointment, Kulik's expedition was groundbreaking. He meticulously documented the destruction, measuring the directions of fallen trees, photographing the eerie landscapes, and mapping the blast zone. His data revealed the radial symmetry of the explosion, a finding that would become crucial for later scientific models. Kulik also collected eyewitness testimonies, interviewing Evenki elders and settlers who still remembered the day vividly. These accounts, though colored by folklore, provided valuable detail about the sequence of events: the blinding flash, the suffocating heat, the thunderous shockwaves. The expedition was not without peril. At one point, Kulik nearly drowned while crossing a river swollen by spring melt. On another occasion, his team was threatened by hostile locals who believed the land was cursed and resented the intrusion of outsiders. Disease, exhaustion, and equipment failure plagued them throughout their journey. Yet Kulik's determination never wavered. For him, Tunguska was not merely a scientific puzzle, it was a personal calling. Over the following years, Kulik returned to Tunguska multiple times, each expedition as grueling as the last. He continued to search for the elusive meteorite fragments, convinced that they lay buried in the swamps or hidden beneath the forest floor. He proposed that the soft, boggy ground might have swallowed the impactor whole, concealing it from view. At other times, he speculated that the object might have vaporized entirely in the atmosphere, leaving only microscopic traces. Though he never found the conclusive proof he sought, his tireless efforts brought Tunguska into the global spotlight. Kulik's work was not only scientific but also symbolic. In the Soviet Union, he became a figure celebrated for his dedication and toughness, embodying the spirit of exploration that the new regime sought to promote. Yet his obsession came at a personal cost. He lived much of his later life in difficult conditions, often ill, often under strain, but always thinking of Tunguska. During World War II, he was captured by German forces and died in a prisoner of war camp in 1942. He never saw the full fruits of his labor, but his legacy endured. Thanks to Kulik, Tunguska was transformed from a forgotten local disaster into one of the greatest scientific mysteries of the modern era. His photographs, maps, and testimonies remain foundational, used by researchers to this day. Though he never solved the riddle of the missing crater, his persistence ensured that the world would never forget the day the sky exploded over Siberia. His story is one of obsession, endurance, and the eternal human drive to seek answers, even in the most hostile of landscapes. By the late 1920s and into the 1930s, thanks to Leonid Kulik's tireless work, the Tunguska blast had finally broken free of obscurity. It was no longer a half-forgotten legend whispered among the Evenki. It was now a scientific puzzle recognized worldwide. But the greatest mystery remained unsolved. What exactly had happened that June morning in 1908? The evidence was at once overwhelming and elusive. Millions of trees flattened, a shockwave felt across continents, but no crater, no massive fragments of rock or iron, and no easy explanation. This void of certainty opened the door to a flood of theories, each stranger and more ambitious than the last. Over time, these ideas would range from the solidly scientific to the wildly speculative, each competing to explain one of history's most confounding natural disasters. The most straightforward and enduring explanation, of course, was that Tunguska had been caused by a cosmic impactor, either an asteroid or a comet fragment that entered Earth's atmosphere and exploded before striking the ground. Kulik himself leaned heavily toward this interpretation, envisioning a stony or metallic meteorite that had disintegrated in midair. On the surface, the evidence seemed to fit. Eyewitnesses described a blinding light streaking across the sky, followed by a massive detonation. The radial pattern of fallen trees matched what one might expect from an aerial explosion. Yet the lack of an impact crater remained a troubling omission. For many scientists, it was difficult to accept that such a colossal event could leave no clear hole in the Earth. This led to competing variations of the cosmic impact theory. Some suggested that the object had been a fragile comet, composed primarily of ice and dust. Such an object, entering the atmosphere at tremendous speed, could have vaporized completely before ever touching the ground. This would explain the absence of a crater, while still accounting for the explosion's immense energy. Comet fragments, after all, are not rare visitors to Earth. They produce the meteor showers we see in the night sky. If Tunguska was indeed a comet, it could have been a larger-than-usual fragment that disintegrated catastrophically. But others countered that a comet should have left behind distinctive chemical traces, unusual isotopes, frozen water signatures, or organic molecules embedded in the soil. While Kulik's early expeditions were not equipped to detect such subtle markers, later investigations also failed to find conclusive evidence of cometary material. Thus, the debate between asteroid versus comet simmered, unresolved, becoming one of the defining scientific controversies of Tunguska research. Beyond the comet hypothesis, there were those who sought explanations closer to Earth. One such idea was that Tunguska had been caused not by something falling from the sky, but by a massive volcanic gas eruption or an explosion of underground methane. Siberia, after all, sits atop vast reserves of natural gas and permafrost. Some researchers speculated that a sudden release of gas, ignited by lightning or another trigger, could have produced a fireball powerful enough to flatten forests and send shockwaves through the atmosphere. At first glance, this theory might seem plausible. Yet critics quickly pointed out its shortcomings. Eyewitnesses described a luminous object streaking across the sky well before the explosion, a trajectory inconsistent with a subterranean gas blast. Moreover, no evidence of volcanic activity was ever found in the region. The Tunguska landscape, apart from the devastation of the forest, bore none of the geological scars one would expect from such an event. As the years went on, the absence of easy answers encouraged ever more imaginative theories. By the 1940s and 1950s, a handful of writers and fringe thinkers began suggesting that the Tunguska blast might have been the result of extraterrestrial technology, perhaps a crashed alien spacecraft or a deliberate detonation from beyond Earth. While mainstream science scoffed at the idea, these notions captured the public imagination, feeding into Cold War-era fascination with UFOs and cosmic mysteries. The symmetry of the blast zone, the missing crater, the inexplicable power, all of these became fuel for speculation. The theory of an alien craft colliding with Earth, though unsupported by evidence, continues to linger on the fringes of Tunguska discussions to this day, a reminder of how the human mind seeks extraordinary answers to extraordinary events. There were also more esoteric interpretations rooted in physics. Some scientists, inspired by the emerging study of nuclear energy, speculated that Tunguska might have been caused by a natural atomic explosion or a release of antimatter. The sheer energy of the blast, estimated to be 10 to 15 megatons of TNT, comparable to a modern nuclear weapon, invited such analogies. Could Tunguska have been Earth's encounter with an antimatter particle, annihilating itself upon contact with the atmosphere? While intriguing, these ideas remain highly speculative, with little direct evidence to support them. But they reflect the way in which Tunguska straddled the line between natural disaster and seemingly impossible phenomenon, defying conventional categories. One particularly fascinating scientific proposal emerged in the late 20th century, that Tunguska might have been the result of a cosmic airburst, a term that would become central to modern interpretations. In this model, the object was not large enough to survive intact to the ground, but instead exploded at high altitude due to atmospheric pressure. The resulting fireball unleashed its energy downward, creating the blast pattern observed on the forest floor. This theory has grown increasingly favored in recent decades, supported by computer simulations and comparisons with smaller airbursts witnessed in modern times, such as the 2013 Chelyabinsk meteor. Yet in the 1930s and 40s, when Kulik and his colleagues were still alive, the debate was far from settled. Kulik clung stubbornly to his vision of a buried meteorite, returning again and again to the Siberian swamps in search of a smoking gun. His death during World War II meant he never saw the later flourishing of Tunguska theories. Still, his work laid the foundation upon which these debates were built. The mystery of Tunguska thus entered a new phase, no longer ignored, no longer silent, but instead contested ground where scientific rigor, speculative imagination, and cultural fascination collided. For every attempt to anchor the event in the familiar laws of physics, there was another willing to suggest the extraordinary. This tug-of-war between explanations mirrored the broader anxieties of the 20th century, a world grappling with war, technology, and the dawning realization that the universe itself might be more dangerous than anyone had imagined. By the mid-century, Tunguska had become more than just a Siberian oddity. It was a symbol of the unknown. Whether seen as the impact of a comet, the airburst of an asteroid, the eruption of methane, or the crash of a UFO, it forced humanity to confront its vulnerability. If such a blast could occur without warning in 1908, what might the future hold? Could it happen again, this time over a city, with millions of lives at stake? The legacy of these early theories was not simply about solving a puzzle. It was about framing the way we think about cosmic threats, about forcing science and society alike to reckon with the fragility of human civilization in the face of forces far beyond our control. Tunguska was both a mystery and a warning, and the proliferation of theories was a reflection of just how desperate humanity was to understand, and perhaps, in understanding, to prepare. By the time the Second World War had ended and the Cold War began to cast its long shadow over the globe, the mystery of Tunguska took on a strange new significance. What had once been a forgotten catastrophe in the Siberian wilderness was now being re-examined through the lens of nuclear science, geopolitics, and paranoia. The 20th century had entered an age defined by weapons of unimaginable power. Suddenly, the Tunguska blast was no longer just a question of geology or astronomy. It was a haunting echo of what humanity itself was now capable of unleashing. In the late 1940s and early 1950s, the world witnessed the detonation of the first atomic and hydrogen bombs. Images of mushroom clouds rising over Hiroshima and Nagasaki, of cities flattened in seconds, were etched into the collective memory of mankind. When scientists compared eyewitness descriptions of Tunguska, blinding flashes, suffocating heat, a shockwave that flattened entire forests, they found eerie parallels. To many, Tunguska began to look less like a natural disaster and more like a nuclear explosion decades before nuclear technology even existed. This realization ignited a wave of speculation. Soviet and Western researchers alike began to wonder if the Tunguska blast might hold clues about the destructive power now in human hands. Some even suggested that studying the event could provide insights into how nuclear detonations affected the atmosphere and the environment. Others, less cautious, entertained the idea that Tunguska had not been natural at all, that perhaps it had been some kind of experiment or accident, an impossible premonition of humanity's future capacity for annihilation. In the Soviet Union, Tunguska was reframed as both a scientific puzzle and a matter of national pride. The 1950s and 1960s were decades when Soviet science sought to compete fiercely with the West, not only in rocketry and space exploration but also in theoretical physics and cosmology. Tunguska was a perfect stage upon which to showcase Soviet ingenuity. Teams of geologists, physicists, and astronomers began publishing papers that re-examined Kulik's data, testing new models of atmospheric explosions and cosmic impacts. But politics was never far from the conversation. To Soviet propagandists, Tunguska symbolized the dangers that lurked beyond Earth, dangers that only the Soviet scientific machine was bold enough to confront. At the same time, the devastation of Tunguska provided a grim comparison to the destructive might of nuclear weapons, proof that nature itself could unleash forces on par with man's most terrible creations. It was a narrative that fit neatly into the Cold War worldview, a universe filled with threats, a race to control knowledge before the enemy could exploit it, and the looming possibility of global catastrophe. Western scientists were equally fascinated, though often from a different angle. In the United States and Europe, the study of Tunguska became entwined with the broader concern about planetary defense, the idea that Earth might one day face another cosmic impact, this time with far greater consequences. The timing was uncanny. As the Cold War pushed humanity closer to self-destruction, nature reminded us that the universe itself could be just as lethal. This duality, human-made apocalypse versus cosmic apocalypse, gave Tunguska a symbolic weight that extended beyond the Siberian wilderness. The UFO craze of the 1950s and 60s added another layer to the story. Popular magazines, tabloids, and fringe writers began suggesting that Tunguska had been caused not by a meteor or comet but by an alien spacecraft, destroyed either by accident or design. In an age when flying saucers filled the skies of popular imagination, Tunguska was rebranded as perhaps the greatest UFO incident in history. Some claimed the symmetrical blast zone was evidence of a controlled detonation, as if an alien pilot had sacrificed their ship to avoid crashing into a populated area. While mainstream science rejected these claims, the idea found fertile ground in a public already saturated with fears of invasion, whether from foreign powers or from outer space. Meanwhile, scientific investigation of the site continued, often under difficult conditions. Expeditions in the 1950s and 60s returned to Tunguska with better equipment, collecting soil samples, tree rings, and tiny fragments of silicate and metallic spheres. These microscopic clues seemed to support the idea of a cosmic body disintegrating in the atmosphere. Yet the lack of a definitive crater or large meteorite fragments remained a persistent frustration. In a way, the mystery deepened with each discovery, mirroring the era's broader anxieties. The more humanity learned, the more uncertain the future seemed. Within the Soviet Union, Tunguska also became a metaphor for secrecy. Just as the government concealed information about nuclear tests, military accidents, and rocket failures, so too did Tunguska embody the tension between what was known and what was hidden. Researchers who studied the event were often restricted in what they could publish, their work filtered through political channels. To outside observers, this only fueled speculation. If the Soviets were being so guarded, did they know something extraordinary about Tunguska that the rest of the world did not? Was it evidence of a natural weapon, or perhaps even an extraterrestrial event too dangerous to reveal? By the 1960s, Tunguska was firmly embedded in Cold War culture. It appeared in science journals and popular science books, in conspiracy pamphlets and science fiction novels. It was compared to atomic tests in the Nevada desert and to the threat of intercontinental ballistic missiles. Its devastation was used as a teaching tool for both natural science and geopolitics. This is what power looks like, whether from the cosmos or from ourselves. In many ways, Tunguska served as a mirror for the era's anxieties. To scientists, it was a problem to be solved, a natural phenomenon that might reveal truths about Earth's vulnerability to impacts. To governments, it was a symbol of power and secrecy, a reminder that nature could unleash destruction as fearsome as any bomb. To the public, it was a mystery tinged with paranoia, a story that fit into the larger tapestry of UFO sightings, nuclear fears, and the sense that humanity was living on the edge of catastrophe. The Cold War lens reshaped the way Tunguska was remembered. What Kulik had seen as a puzzle of meteorites became, in the nuclear age, a metaphor for apocalypse itself. The forests of Siberia were no longer just a scientific curiosity. They were a warning, a silent testimony to the scale of destruction that could be unleashed in an instant. Whether from the stars or from human hands, the message was the same. Power this great could not be ignored, and survival depended on understanding it. As the Cold War marched onward, the obsession with Tunguska did not fade. Instead, it fed into a growing awareness that humanity lived on a fragile planet in a dangerous universe. The question was no longer simply what happened in 1908, it was also what could happen tomorrow, and whether the next Tunguska might strike not a remote forest, but the heart of civilization. For more than a century, the Tunguska event remained a stubborn riddle, an explosion of staggering power with no clear culprit, a wound upon the Siberian forest that seemed to defy the known laws of nature. But as science advanced through the late 20th century and into the 21st, new tools and discoveries began to peel away the layers of mystery. Satellite imaging, advanced computer simulations, and high-powered chemical analysis allowed researchers to revisit the Tunguska blast with fresh eyes. And in an ironic twist of fate, a much smaller but eerily similar event would occur in 2013. Over the Russian city of Chelyabinsk, providing the closest thing to a living laboratory for understanding what had happened in 1908. The modern era of Tunguska research began in earnest in the 1960s and 70s, when Soviet scientists returned to the site with better equipment than Kulik had ever dreamed of. They collected soil cores, tree ring samples, and tiny microscopic particles embedded in the bark of trees. What they found were microspherules, small glassy beads rich in nickel and iron, the chemical signatures of extraterrestrial material. For many researchers, this was the smoking gun. While no massive meteorite fragments had ever been located, these microscopic clues strongly suggested that a cosmic body had indeed exploded in the atmosphere, raining down dust and vaporized debris over the forest. Tree ring studies also provided tantalizing evidence. Trees that survived the blast exhibited unusual growth patterns in the years immediately afterward, narrow rings consistent with environmental stress. Some researchers even claimed to detect traces of rare isotopes, the kind expected from extraterrestrial material. Though these findings were hotly debated, they added weight to the idea that Tunguska had been caused not by a terrestrial gas explosion, nor by alien technology, but by something from the heavens. By the 1980s and 90s, computer models offered new ways to test hypotheses. Scientists began running simulations of asteroid and comet impacts, comparing the predicted blast patterns with the actual maps drawn by Kulik and his successors. The results were striking. An object between 50 and 100 meters in diameter, entering Earth's atmosphere at tremendous speed, could indeed release energy equivalent to a massive thermonuclear bomb. Exploding at an altitude of around 5 to 10 kilometers, it would flatten forests in a radial pattern, ignite fires, and produce shockwaves felt hundreds of kilometers away, all without leaving a crater. In other words, Tunguska perfectly matched the profile of a cosmic airburst. Still, questions lingered. Was the object a stony asteroid, or was it a fragile comet fragment? Advocates for the comet theory pointed out the lack of substantial meteoritic debris and suggested that only an icy body could have vaporized so completely. Those favoring an asteroid countered that small stony fragments might have dispersed widely or eroded in the swampy ground over the decades. The debate grew into one of the most enduring battles in planetary science, with each camp marshalling its evidence like lawyers in a trial. Then came the morning of February 15, 2013, when the universe itself delivered a case study. Over the Russian city of Chelyabinsk, a 20-meter asteroid entered Earth's atmosphere at a shallow angle, glowing brighter than the sun as it streaked across the sky. At an altitude of about 30 kilometers, it exploded with the force of 400 to 500 kilotons of TNT. The shockwave shattered windows across the city, injured more than 1,000 people, and set off car alarms for miles around. Though far smaller in scale than Tunguska, Chelyabinsk provided scientists with a treasure trove of data. Countless eyewitness videos, seismic records, and even recovered fragments of the meteorite itself, fished out of a lake. The parallels to Tunguska were undeniable. In both cases, a celestial object had disintegrated in the atmosphere, unleashing enormous energy without leaving a conventional impact crater. The Chelyabinsk event gave scientists a chance to study the physics of airbursts in real time, confirming what decades of theory had suggested. And in doing so, it lent powerful support to the idea that Tunguska had been caused by a much larger version of the same phenomenon, an asteroid or comet fragment exploding in midair. What Chelyabinsk also revealed, however, was just how vulnerable modern society remains to cosmic impacts. In 1908, Tunguska struck an unpopulated wilderness. In 2013, Chelyabinsk exploded over a city of more than 1 million people. Had the Tunguska object struck over Moscow, New York, or London, the devastation would have been beyond imagination. Entire urban landscapes could have been leveled, millions killed, and civilization itself profoundly shaken. The Tunguska mystery was no longer just a question of what happened in the past, it was a chilling reminder of what could happen in the future. Modern science has continued to probe Tunguska with ever more refined methods. Satellite imagery has been used to map the blast zone, confirming the radial patterns Kulik observed but on a scale he could never fully capture. Soil and peat samples have been analyzed with sophisticated spectrometry, revealing traces of rare elements consistent with cosmic origins. Computer models have become increasingly precise, allowing researchers to test variables such as entry angle, velocity, and composition. The consensus today leans strongly toward a stony asteroid between 50 and 60 meters in diameter, traveling at about 27 kilometers per second, that exploded in the atmosphere at an altitude of 5 to 10 kilometers. And yet, the debates continue. Some researchers still champion the comet theory, arguing that chemical signatures in the soil point to volatile ices rather than rock. Others suggest hybrid scenarios, where a cometary fragment containing stony inclusions might explain both the lack of large debris and the presence of microspherules. More speculative voices continue to push alternative explanations, mini black holes, antimatter, or even alien technology, though these remain far outside the scientific mainstream. What unites these discussions is the recognition that Tunguska is not merely a historical curiosity. It is a case study in planetary defense, a natural experiment in the kind of cosmic hazards Earth may face again. The Chelyabinsk event underscored the reality. Tunguska was not a once-in-a-million-year freak accident. Smaller airbursts happen with alarming regularity, and larger impacts, though rarer, are inevitable on long enough timescales. Tunguska, in this sense, is both a mystery solved and a warning unheeded. As modern science circles ever closer to the truth, the Tunguska blast continues to hold a kind of mythic power. It is remembered not only as an explosion in a remote forest, but as a symbol of humanity's fragility beneath the vastness of space. Kulik's ghost still lingers in the fallen trees, as does the fear of what another Tunguska might mean for a world far more densely populated and technologically fragile than in 1908. The mystery may never be completely resolved, whether asteroid or comet, vaporized entirely or dispersed into fragments too small to find. But perhaps the exact answer matters less than the lesson it carries, that our planet is vulnerable, that the cosmos is unpredictable, and that the Tunguska blast was not an isolated miracle, but a glimpse of a threat that will one day return. Long after the trees of Tunguska had been flattened and the shockwaves had rippled across continents, the blast continued to reverberate in the human imagination. What happened in the skies over Siberia on June 30, 1908, was not merely a scientific puzzle. It was a cultural spark, igniting countless myths, works of fiction, conspiracy theories, and popular fascinations that have endured for more than a century. In many ways, the cultural legacy of Tunguska has been just as influential as its scientific mystery, shaping how people think about the fragility of Earth, the possibility of cosmic catastrophe, and the tantalizing unknowns that lie beyond our atmosphere. Almost immediately after the first expeditions reached the blast zone in the 1920s and 30s, Tunguska entered the public imagination as something almost otherworldly. Early newspaper articles portrayed it as a cosmic catastrophe, language that resonated with a world fascinated by both technology and the unknown. As photographs of the flattened forests began to circulate, the blast became a visual symbol of sudden and incomprehensible destruction. To readers far removed from Siberia, the images seemed to blur the line between science and science fiction. By the mid-20th century, Tunguska had become fertile ground for literature and cinema. Soviet writers used the event as a backdrop for speculative fiction, exploring themes of cosmic danger, extraterrestrial life, and human vulnerability. Authors like Alexander Kazantsev popularized the idea that Tunguska might have been caused by a crashing alien spacecraft, a notion that captured the Soviet public's imagination in the 1940s and 50s, and later spread worldwide. Kazantsev's stories presented Tunguska not as a cold geological mystery but as a thrilling narrative of first contact gone wrong, blending scientific speculation with the growing fascination with UFOs. Western culture soon followed suit. The mystery of Tunguska appeared in pulp magazines, science fiction novels, and eventually film. It became shorthand for unexplained devastation, a metaphor for the destructive power of forces beyond human control. In some stories, it was the handiwork of aliens. In others, the result of secret experiments, antimatter, or even time travel mishaps. By the 1960s and 70s, Tunguska had joined the pantheon of enduring mysteries alongside Atlantis, the Bermuda Triangle, and Roswell, subjects that invited endless retellings and reinterpretations. The UFO craze of the Cold War era only deepened Tunguska's cultural grip. Popular writers and conspiracy theorists seized on the absence of a crater as evidence of extraterrestrial involvement. Books and documentaries suggested that the symmetrical blast pattern could have been caused by a controlled detonation, perhaps an alien vessel self-destructing to avoid a collision with Earth. Others claimed that the Soviet government was covering up alien wreckage, hidden in the depths of the Siberian wilderness. Though mainstream scientists dismissed such claims, they captivated the public and ensured that Tunguska remained alive in popular discourse. Meanwhile, the blast became a recurring subject in the paranormal and fringe communities. It was linked to theories about ancient civilizations, to secret Nazi technology, even to supernatural events. In these retellings, Tunguska was not simply a meteor or comet, it was a doorway to hidden truths, a cipher through which enthusiasts could project their deepest fears and hopes. Whether as evidence of alien visitors, government conspiracies, or cosmic omens, Tunguska was endlessly adaptable, a mystery spacious enough to contain whatever narrative people needed it to support. Beyond conspiracy, Tunguska also had a profound influence on mainstream science communication. As planetary science matured in the late 20th century, educators and popular science writers began using Tunguska as a vivid example of Earth's vulnerability to impacts. The scale of the blast, comparable to the largest nuclear weapons, offered a stark way to communicate the reality of cosmic hazards. Television documentaries in the 1970s, 80s, and 90s often used Tunguska as their starting point, a chilling story that could draw viewers in before expanding to the broader subject of asteroid impacts and planetary defense. Video games, too, embraced Tunguska. From Cold War-era strategy games to science fiction adventures, developers used the event as a ready-made plot device, a mystery that could justify alien encounters, secret weapons, or hidden laboratories. The very name Tunguska became shorthand for strange, catastrophic, and unexplained phenomena. In modern pop culture, references to the blast can be found everywhere, from episodes of The X-Files, where it was tied to alien colonization, to role-playing games that spin entire narratives out of the unexplained explosion in Siberia. What makes Tunguska so enduring in culture is its ambiguity. Unlike the Chicxulub impact that ended the age of dinosaurs, Tunguska has no crater to anchor the imagination. The absence of a definitive explanation leaves space for speculation, and in that space, stories thrive. Humans are narrative creatures, and Tunguska offers a stage for every kind of narrative: cautionary tale, science fiction, conspiracy, or prophecy. The event also resonates because it taps into universal fears. The idea that, without warning, the sky itself might explode with the force of thousands of bombs is profoundly unsettling. It strips away the illusion of safety and control, reminding us that we are small creatures on a fragile world, subject to cosmic forces far beyond our power. In the cultural imagination, Tunguska becomes not just a mystery of the past but a symbol of existential vulnerability. At the same time, Tunguska inspires awe. The sheer scale of the blast, the survival of eyewitnesses who described fire in the sky and trees turned to ash, it reads like mythology, a modern Prometheus or Ragnarok. For some, Tunguska carries almost religious overtones, an event that hints at the presence of powers greater than ourselves, whether those powers are natural, extraterrestrial, or divine. Today, more than a century later, Tunguska continues to be invoked in art, literature, and popular media. It remains a staple of documentaries, a recurring theme in speculative fiction, and a favorite subject of online discussions and YouTube explorations. Each generation reinterprets the blast through its own anxieties. For the Cold War, it was nuclear destruction. For the space age, asteroid impacts. For the Internet era, it is woven into conspiracies and alternate histories. The cultural impact of Tunguska is thus not a static story but a living one. It evolves with us, reflecting our fears, our fascinations, and our enduring need to find meaning in the unexplained. It is a mirror, not only of the cosmos, but of ourselves. For every serious scientific explanation that has been proposed for Tunguska, there has always been an alternative, a stranger, darker, and often more sensational theory that refuses to die. These are the theories whispered in late-night conversations, written into speculative books, or featured in documentaries that blur the line between fact and fantasy. They range from the improbable to the outright bizarre, yet their persistence reveals something profound about human nature, our appetite for mystery, our suspicion of official narratives, and our fascination with forces that seem larger than life. Tunguska, more than perhaps any other natural event of the 20th century, has become a magnet for such speculation. One of the earliest and most enduring alternative theories is that Tunguska was the crash of an alien spacecraft. This idea took hold in the Soviet Union during the mid-20th century, popularized by authors like Alexander Kazantsev, who suggested that the explosion matched the profile of a massive spaceship's nuclear engine detonating in the atmosphere. To its supporters, the lack of a crater and the absence of large meteorite fragments were not scientific puzzles but evidence of advanced technology disintegrating under extraordinary stress. Over time, this theory mutated into countless variations. Some claimed the craft had been a reconnaissance vessel that malfunctioned, while others suggested it was a deliberate act of cosmic intervention, an alien ship sacrificing itself to prevent a larger meteor from striking Earth. In each case, Tunguska became less a scientific anomaly and more a narrative of first contact, cloaked in tragedy. Equally audacious is the theory that Tunguska was caused by a miniature black hole passing through Earth. First proposed in the 1970s, this idea captured headlines because of its sheer audacity. A tiny black hole, no larger than an atom yet possessing the mass of a mountain, could, in theory, punch through Earth's crust, releasing an enormous burst of energy as it entered and exited. Advocates argued that this could explain the blast's symmetry and the absence of debris. Of course, the physics behind this theory have been heavily criticized. Such a black hole would have left a dramatic exit wound on the opposite side of the planet, which was never observed. But despite its flaws, the black hole hypothesis became a cult favorite, precisely because it painted the event as something almost unimaginably cosmic. Then there are the antimatter theories, which propose that Tunguska was caused by a collision between Earth and a chunk of antimatter from space. Antimatter, when it encounters normal matter, annihilates both in a burst of pure energy. A mass of antimatter the size of a small asteroid could, in theory, release the energy seen at Tunguska without leaving behind physical fragments. While elegant in its simplicity, the idea falters under scrutiny. Scientists point out that an antimatter impact would have produced distinct radiation signatures not observed at the site. Still, the concept of antimatter, so exotic and mysterious to most people, proved irresistible, and the theory lingers in the cultural imagination. Some theories stray even further from the realm of astrophysics and into the territory of paranormal or supernatural speculation. There are those who claim Tunguska was the result of a secret experiment gone wrong, a prototype weapon or energy device tested by early 20th century inventors. The most famous version links the event to Nikola Tesla, whose experiments with wireless energy transmission and death rays were legendary in his own lifetime. According to this story, Tesla attempted to demonstrate his technology by beaming power across the globe, only for the energy to unleash catastrophic destruction over Siberia. While there is no evidence that Tesla had either the capability or the intent to cause such devastation, his name continues to be invoked whenever science bleeds into myth. Another strand of fringe thinking ties Tunguska to ancient prophecies or curses. In some local Siberian traditions, the event is remembered not in scientific terms but as an act of divine or spiritual retribution. Shamans spoke of the god of fire punishing the land, and in some retellings, Tunguska becomes a mythic event, a reminder of cosmic powers far beyond human comprehension. In the West, esoteric writers have linked Tunguska to apocalyptic predictions, suggesting that it was a warning of greater catastrophes to come. The conspiracy culture of the late 20th century also adopted Tunguska. Some writers claimed that the Soviet government had discovered something extraordinary at the site and covered it up: alien technology, dangerous radiation, or evidence of a cosmic phenomenon too destabilizing to reveal. These narratives flourish precisely because Tunguska occurred in such a remote and inaccessible region. The difficulty of obtaining first-hand information allowed imaginations to run wild, transforming an enigmatic explosion into a secret shrouded in political intrigue. What is striking about these theories is not their scientific merit. Most have been thoroughly debunked or lack evidence, but their cultural persistence. Each theory reflects the anxieties and fascinations of its time. The alien spacecraft hypothesis emerged during the dawn of the space age, when UFO sightings dominated headlines. The black hole and antimatter theories gained traction as quantum physics and particle science entered the public consciousness. Tesla-related theories flourished in an era when internet culture revived interest in eccentric geniuses and lost inventions. And conspiracy versions thrive today in an age where distrust of authority and fascination with hidden truths are at an all-time high. In this way, Tunguska functions as a cultural canvas, a blank space onto which generations project their fears, curiosities, and suspicions. Scientists may insist that the most likely explanation is a stony asteroid exploding in the atmosphere, but for many, that conclusion lacks the drama and allure of the alternatives. After all, a meteor is an act of nature. An alien craft, a black hole, or a Tesla death ray makes the universe feel charged with mystery and narrative. Even today, videos, forums, and documentaries continue to revisit these fringe explanations, ensuring that the Tunguska mystery remains alive in the popular mind. Rational science may dominate the academic journals, but in the public imagination, the strange theories are just as real, just as vivid, and perhaps even more compelling. Ultimately, these alternative explanations tell us as much about ourselves as they do about the event. Tunguska is a reminder that humans crave stories, that we seek patterns even in chaos, and that when the sky explodes and the world trembles, we would rather imagine aliens, black holes, or forbidden experiments than face the sobering reality of a universe that can, at any moment, strike us down without warning. More than a century after the early morning silence of Siberia was shattered by an explosion that shook the earth, the Tunguska event endures not just as a scientific riddle, but as a warning carved into history. Unlike a meteorite crater that can be neatly studied, Tunguska left behind only devastation, mystery, and lessons that humanity has struggled to fully heed. To close the story of Tunguska is to look beyond Siberia, beyond 1908, and confront what this blast tells us about our place beneath a vast and indifferent sky. The first lesson is one of humility. The Tunguska explosion, releasing the force of thousands of Hiroshima bombs, did not require a planet-killing asteroid. It came not from a world-ending impact but from a relatively small object, just 50 to 60 meters in diameter, that never even touched the ground. This simple fact shatters the illusion of safety. It reminds us that the cosmos does not need to throw its largest weapons at Earth to devastate us. Something the size of a city block can level forests, flatten landscapes, and, if it's struck in the wrong place, annihilate an entire metropolis. The second lesson is about luck. Tunguska happened in one of the most remote and sparsely populated regions on the planet. Had the same object entered Earth's atmosphere hours earlier or later, its blast might have struck a major city in Europe or Asia. Imagine the shockwaves tearing through London, the fireball over St. Petersburg, or the flattened ruins of Moscow. Millions could have perished, and the course of the 20th century would have been violently rewritten. Instead, the Tunguska object chose wilderness, and so its destruction claimed only trees, wildlife, and scattered reindeer herds. But humanity cannot count on such luck forever. This leads to the third lesson: vulnerability. Tunguska showed us that Earth is not a fortress. We live in a solar system filled with debris, asteroids, comets, and fragments left over from creation itself. Every so often, one of these bodies crosses paths with Earth. Most burn up harmlessly in the atmosphere. Some survive as shooting stars. But occasionally, one is large enough to do what Tunguska did, or worse. The geological record is filled with scars of past impacts, from craters miles wide to layers of ash that mark ancient extinctions. Tunguska was not unique. It was a chapter in an ongoing story, one that will inevitably repeat. Modern science has absorbed these lessons, but often too slowly. In the decades after Tunguska, humanity built nuclear arsenals, reached space, and walked on the moon. Yet for much of the 20th century, little effort was made to track or prepare for cosmic threats. Tunguska was treated more as a curiosity than a warning. It was not until the late 20th and early 21st centuries, especially after the 2013 Chelyabinsk airburst, that governments began to seriously consider planetary defense. Today, space agencies map near-Earth objects with telescopes, simulate asteroid deflections, and test technologies like NASA's DART mission, which successfully altered the orbit of a small asteroid in 2022. These efforts are the direct descendants of lessons first taught by Tunguska. But preparation remains uneven. Thousands of potentially hazardous objects larger than Tunguska's asteroid have been catalogued, but countless smaller ones remain invisible until they arrive. Chelyabinsk proved this when it entered Earth's atmosphere without warning, caught on dashcams rather than telescopes. If humanity is to survive the next Tunguska, or something larger, it must invest not just in weapons and satellites, but in global cooperation. No single nation can shield the planet from the sky. The cultural legacy of Tunguska is equally powerful. In literature, film, and folklore, it has become a symbol of cosmic fragility. Some view it as a cautionary tale of nature's dominance, others as evidence of hidden truths, alien encounters, lost technologies, divine retribution. Each retelling, whether scientific or speculative, reflects the same underlying truth. Tunguska touched something primal in us, the awareness that our world is vulnerable and that the universe is far from tame. And yet, there is another lesson, one of responsibility. For the first time in history, humanity possesses the knowledge and tools to anticipate cosmic impacts. We can model trajectories, detect asteroids years before they arrive, and even alter their paths. Tunguska revealed the danger. Modern science offers the possibility of defense. Whether we act on that possibility is a test of our priorities. Do we continue to treat space as a frontier for competition, or do we acknowledge it as a realm that requires cooperation for survival? Looking back, Tunguska also forces us to reflect on our relationship with the unknown. For decades, the event remained wrapped in mystery. Was it a comet? An asteroid? Something stranger? People filled the gaps with imagination. Aliens, black holes, Tesla's inventions. These stories reveal not just skepticism toward official science, but also a deeper human need to weave meaning into chaos. The truth, as science shows us, is awe-inspiring enough. The cosmos hurled a rock at Earth, and it exploded with apocalyptic force in our skies. No conspiracy could match the raw indifference of that fact. But perhaps the greatest lesson of Tunguska is perspective. When we think of disasters, we often imagine wars, plagues, or climate shifts. Tunguska reminds us that threats can also come from beyond Earth, that our story is entwined with the greater story of the universe. It situates us not as masters of our planet, but as vulnerable participants in a cosmic ballet, where unseen objects drift silently through space until, one day, they cross our path. As we conclude the story of Tunguska, it is tempting to ask, is the mystery solved? Was it an asteroid, a comet, or something stranger? The scientific consensus leans toward an asteroid airburst, yet absolute certainty may always elude us. The swampy ground swallowed evidence, the forest healed and grew back, the decades erased the clearest traces. But in a way, the lack of a definitive answer is fitting. Tunguska is both a fact and a fable, a physical event and a cultural myth. It is an explosion that continues to echo, not just in Siberia, but across human memory. So what does Tunguska ultimately mean? For us, it is a reminder to look upward, to recognize that we live on a small blue world vulnerable to fire from skies. It is a call to action, urging us to prepare for what will inevitably come again. And it is a story, strange, frightening, or inspiring, that reminds us how little separates ordinary days from extraordinary cataclysms. The forest has regrown in Siberia. The silence has returned. But the lesson of Tunguska remains, written in fallen trees, in shaken witnesses, in the very air that trembled that morning. One day, another Tunguska will come. Whether we are ready, or whether we, like the Siberian wilderness, are caught unprepared, is the question history has left us to answer.